Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been a hunter all my life. Been tracking game through the forests of the Pacific Northwest since I was 12 years old with my dad. Those woods are like a second home to me, or at least they were, until that night 3 years ago. I'm only sharing this now because the nightmares won't stop, and maybe putting it into words will help. I've told exactly 4 people about what happened. My son, my brother, and 2 hunting buddies I've known for 20 years. My wife knows something happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her everything. She already thinks I spend too much time in those damn woods, as she calls them. It was late October, prime hunting season in Washington state. I'd taken a week off work to do some tracking with my 3 Walker hounds, Duke, Bandit, and Sadie. Those dogs were fearless. I've seen Duke tree a black bear and hold it there, barking his head off like he was ready to take it on himself. They were bred for hunting, with tracking instincts better than any GPS. That night, I decided to try a new spot about 20 miles east of my usual hunting grounds. There had been reports of good game in the area, and I wanted to scout it out before bringing my son up there. I parked my truck at an old logging road around 9 in the evening, planning to track through the night when the animals are most active. The weather was perfect, crisp autumn air, clear sky with a nearly full moon providing decent visibility. I packed light, just my rifle, some jerky, water, and a small pack with essential gear. No flashlight though, which I know sounds crazy, but I've always preferred to let my eyes adjust to the natural light. Flashlights just draw attention and ruin your night vision. By midnight, we'd covered about 4 miles into dense forest. The dogs were working but hadn't picked up anything substantial. Just after 2 in the morning, I decided to take a break on a fallen log while the dogs sniffed around nearby. I remember checking my watch, 2:17 exactly, and thinking maybe I should head back if we didn't find a trail soon. I was taking a sip of water when I heard it, a branch snapping, maybe 40 yards behind me. Not the normal forest sounds I've heard thousands of times. This was deliberate, heavy. I turned slowly, expecting to see maybe a deer or elk watching me. Instead, I saw my dogs, and that's when my blood ran cold. Duke, Bandit, and Sadie were huddled behind me, pressed against the log. They weren't growling or barking. They were trembling. Duke, who would charge a bear without hesitation, had his tail tucked between his legs. I'd never seen them like this, ever. I reached for my rifle, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence is never a good sign. Then came the voices. Not human voices, but not animal either. A sort of low, guttural mumbling that carried through the trees. At first I thought maybe there were hikers lost in the woods, but who would be 5 miles from the nearest road at 2 in the morning? And these sounds, they weren't English or any language I recognized. I stayed absolutely still, my heart hammering so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating patches of silver light and deep shadow. And then I saw movement in one of those shadows. It wasn't quick, it was deliberate, massive. What stepped into a patch of moonlight made me question my sanity. A figure, walking upright on 2 legs, covered in dark hair. But it wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand 10 to 12 feet tall. Bears don't walk with the purposeful stride of a human. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing at first. Behind this massive figure came another, similar in size but slightly different in build. And behind them a smaller one, maybe 8 feet tall. Then at the rear, what looked like a juvenile, still, taller than me at what I'd guess was 5 or 6 feet. They were walking in formation, the juvenile in front, the 2 largest ones side by side behind it, and what I assumed was the female bringing up the rear. They moved with purpose, like they were heading somewhere specific. I didn't move. I couldn't. My fingers were frozen on my rifle, but I hadn't raised it. Some primal instinct told me that making any sudden movement would be the last thing I ever did. They were about 30 feet away when the largest one stopped abruptly. It lifted its head, its massive chest expanding as it took a deep, audible sniff of the air. The sound carried clearly in the silent forest. This thing was scenting me. All four creatures turned in unison, looking directly at where I sat. The moonlight caught their faces, and I could make out features that were both human-like and not. Eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Wide, flat noses, heavy brow ridges. The tallest one, I'm guessing a male, took one step toward me. One massive step that covered about 3 feet of ground. I thought I was going to die right there. But then something unexpected happened. The other large one, also male from what I could tell, reached out and grabbed the first one's shoulder. It leaned in and made a series of low sounds, almost like it was whispering into the other's ear. I swear on my life, it was communicating. During this interaction, I noticed its eyes flick down to my rifle, then back to me. It was assessing the threat. That rifle probably saved my life, even though I'm not sure a .30-06 would have done much against creatures that size. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the family group changed direction. They veered off into the brush about 20 feet away from me, moving with surprising silence for their size. The only sounds were the occasional snapping of branches under their weight. I stayed frozen on that log for at least an hour after they disappeared. My dogs refused to move, still trembling against me. When I finally worked up the courage to stand, my legs nearly gave out. I had to drag the dogs by their collars for the first half-mile until they finally started walking on their own, constantly looking over their shoulders. I made it back to my truck just as dawn was breaking. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. What haunts me most is the intelligence I saw. These weren't animals. The way they communicated, the way they moved in formation, the fact that one stopped the other from approaching me, there was thinking behind those actions. That wasn't my only encounter, though it was by far the closest. Over the years, I've had strange experiences across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Once, while fishing on Lake Chelan at night, something started throwing rocks into the water near my boat. Not pebbles, rocks the size of softballs. When I turned my spotlight toward the shore, I saw nothing, but heard heavy movement in the brush. Another time, while night fishing on a remote lake near the Cascades, I heard what sounded like calls being answered across the water. Deep, resonant whoops that went back and forth for nearly an hour. No human could have made those sounds. But what really confirmed it for me happened 2 summers ago. I finally worked up the courage to take my son hunting near the Canadian border in Oroville. We set up camp and, as an experiment, I placed some apples in the lower branches of trees surrounding our campsite, about 7 feet off the ground. In the morning, every apple was gone. That could have been anything, bears, raccoons, whatever. But what wasn't normal was the perfect circle of deer hair left on the ground beneath one of the trees. Not scattered fur from a kill, but deliberately placed in a perfect circle about 2 feet in diameter. And here's the kicker. Both our cell phones were completely dead. Fully charged the night before, both dead by morning. No battery drain, no overheating, just dead. They started working again once we drove about 15 miles from that spot. I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was people in suits playing an elaborate prank. Maybe I dozed off on that log and dreamed the whole thing. But my dogs saw it too. They were never the same after that night. Duke, who used to be fearless, would refuse to go into certain parts of the woods after dark. They knew what they saw. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that part of the forest. I'm not sure what those creatures were. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. All I know is they're real, they're intelligent, and they're watching us when we enter their territory. The scientific part of me wants proof, a photo, a hair sample, something concrete. But the part of me that sat on that log and looked into those eyes, That part is perfectly content to never get close enough for proof again. I still wake up sometimes, hearing that deep sniff of air, seeing those reflective eyes turning toward me in the moonlight. I'll never forget the way my fearless hunting dogs cowered behind me, or how something that massive could move so quietly through the forest. I don't expect everyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived it. But I know what I saw, and I know those creatures are out there, moving through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, watching, waiting, and occasionally letting themselves be seen. Story 2. I'm still shaken by what happened to me almost 12 years ago. I've been a wildlife researcher for almost 15 years now, and I've seen my fair share of strange things in the wilderness, but nothing like what I encountered on October 10th, 2011. I'd been working on documenting changes in animal populations in Blackwood Forest for several months. The area had seen some unusual migration patterns, and my job was to track and record wildlife activity. That morning started like any other. I packed my usual gear, camera, sample collection kit, field journal, water, some protein bars, and my GPS unit. The weather was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, with that crisp autumn feel in the air. I'd been following one of the fire access routes, those dirt paths they maintain for emergency vehicles. It was around 1 in the afternoon, and I'd been hiking for about 3 hours. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about stopping for lunch soon. That's when I saw it, a footprint in the soft dirt near a small clearing. At first, I thought maybe someone had been through recently, but as I got closer, I realized this was nothing like a human footprint. This thing was massive, easily 19 inches long. The ball of the foot measured about 7¼ inches wide, with the heel around 5½ inches. What really got me was how clearly defined the toes were. 5 distinct toe impressions, but not like human toes. These were broader, with what looked like tough skin patterns pressed into the mud. I've tracked bears, elk, moose, you name it. But this wasn't anything I recognized. My first instinct was to document it, so I took out my camera and shot several photos from different angles. I even placed my field journal next to it for scale. While I was photographing the print, I noticed something else nearby, a pile of feces that looked fresh. Being a researcher, I'm used to examining animal scat, so I took a closer look. It contained partially digested vegetation, but also, and this was weird, crayfish shells and what appeared to be the remains of freshwater mollusks. Whatever left this was omnivorous, eating both plant matter and small aquatic creatures. I was collecting a sample of the scat when I felt this. I don't know how to describe it other than a sensation of being watched. You know that feeling that crawls up your spine? That's what hit me. I slowly straightened up and looked around, and there it was, about 80 feet ahead of me, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees, stood a figure. My first thought was, that's a person. But within seconds, I knew I was wrong. This thing was tall. I'd estimate between 7 and 7½ feet. Its body was massive, with an incredibly solid chest and shoulders that would make a bodybuilder look small. I'd guess it weighed at least 350 pounds, maybe more. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms hung lower, the shoulders were too broad, and the head sat directly on those shoulders with barely any neck visible. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I couldn't make out facial features clearly at that distance, but I could see dark eyes watching me intently. Then it moved. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. This creature covered about 40 feet in just 3 strides. The speed was impossible, like watching a nature documentary on fast forward. It moved with this fluid grace that defied its size, veering suddenly down a ridge at a 45-degree angle. I stood there, completely stunned, watching as it traversed an entire ridgeline. The terrain was brutal. an 8% grade running about 150 feet down into a valley, then up another equally steep ridge on the other side. No human could have navigated that terrain at that speed. Not even a horse or a dirt bike could have matched the effortless way this thing moved across the landscape. It was like watching water flow downhill, just completely natural and unhindered by the laws of physics that should apply to something that size. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear crashing sounds, branches breaking, leaves rustling, but that's another thing that stuck with me. This massive creature moved through the forest, making no more noise than a squirrel. How is that even possible? Something weighing over 300 pounds should have made the forest floor thunder with each step. When it hit patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy, I could see its fur clearly, dark brown with this distinctive reddish sheen, not uniform in color but varied, like the coat of a wild animal that's adapted to blend into its environment. After it disappeared over the second ridge, I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my camera. I managed to take a few photos of the direction it had gone, but I knew they wouldn't capture what I'd witnessed. Once I somewhat collected myself, my researcher instincts kicked in. I carefully approached the area where I'd first spotted the creature. Near a large oak tree, I found something interesting. A ground hornet's nest that had been dug out. The earth around it was freshly disturbed, and the nest was torn open. Most predators that go after hornet nests, bears for example, make a mess of the area. But this excavation was different, more precise, almost surgical in its approach. I've read about certain primates that harvest what some researchers call hornet honey. It's not actually honey, but a nutritious food source made up of nectar and insect proteins that's stored with the larvae. Could this creature have been harvesting that? The thought sent a chill through me. It suggested not just animal behavior, but something with knowledge, with strategy. As I was examining the nest, I noticed something else. A few strands of hair caught on the rough bark of a nearby tree. They were long, coarse, and had that same reddish-brown color I'd seen on the creature. I carefully collected them in a sample bag, my hands still trembling. By this point, I was seriously on edge. The forest had gone quiet, no bird calls, no squirrels chattering, just that heavy silence that happens when something has disturbed the natural order. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that figure watching me again. The walk back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift and move. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached my vehicle, I practically threw my gear in the back and locked myself inside. I sat there for a good 20 minutes, just breathing, trying to calm down enough to drive. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? No, the movement pattern was all wrong. A human in some kind of costume. Impossible. No human could move like that across that terrain. I drove straight back to my cabin, checking the rearview mirror the entire time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, probably just normal forest sounds, but my mind kept turning them into footsteps, into something large moving around my cabin. The next morning, I went through my photos and samples. The footprint photos were clear, thankfully. The hair samples looked like nothing I'd ever studied before, thicker than human hair, but not quite like bear or other large mammal fur either. I've spent years trying to make sense of what I saw that day. I've gone back to that location several times, always with other researchers, but we've never found anything conclusive. The hair samples I collected were inconclusive in lab tests, similar to primate hair but not matching any known species. Some of my colleagues think I saw a bear and my mind played tricks on me. Others suggest it might have been some kind of undocumented primate, though how something that large could remain undiscovered in North American forests is hard to explain. A few have hinted that maybe the stress of fieldwork got to me. But I know what I saw. That fluid, movement, the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberate way it harvested from that hornet's nest. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, feeling those eyes watching me through the trees. Whatever that thing was, it didn't belong in any wildlife textbook I've ever studied. And the most terrifying thought of all is that it's still out there, moving silently through Blackwood Forest, watching and waiting. Story 3. I've always considered myself a rational person. I work in IT, I trust in science, and I've never been one for ghost stories or cryptid nonsense. But what happened last spring in the Chattahoochee National Forest has completely shattered my worldview. I've spent months trying to make sense of it, debating whether to share this at all. I'm not looking for answers anymore. I just need to get this off my chest. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me, Thomas, my buddy Mike from college, his brother Jake, and our friends Sarah and Devin planned a weekend getaway in Murray County. We'd all been camping plenty of times before. I've personally been going to those woods since I was a kid. Nothing about this trip seemed different from any other. We found a nice spot near a creek on Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, clear skies, just a slight breeze rustling through the trees. We set up our 3 tents, gathered firewood, and spent the day hiking around the area. Everything was completely normal. After dinner that night, we sat around the campfire drinking beers and sharing stories. It must have been around 11 when we heard it, this high-pitched, shrill sound coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond our campsite. It's hard to describe. Kind of like a cross between a whistle and a screech, but with this weird warbling quality to it. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, looking around nervously. Mike shrugged it off. "Probably just a panther or something." But I could tell from his face he wasn't convinced. Jake, who's been hunting in these woods for years, shook his head. "That's no panther. Never heard anything like that before." We tried to ignore it, but about 20 minutes later we heard it again. Same exact sound, same volume, same direction. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Whatever was making that noise wasn't moving closer or further away. It was staying in one spot, almost like it was watching us. "Maybe we should pack up and move somewhere else," Devin suggested after the 3rd call. By then, the mood around the campfire had completely shifted. No one was relaxing anymore. "It's pitch black out there," I said. "We're better off staying put until morning." We kept the fire going strong and huddled closer together. The calls continued at almost exactly 20-minute intervals. What bothered me most wasn't just the sound itself, but how precise the timing was. Animals don't do that. They don't calculate. They don't strategize. Around 1 in the morning, during a period of tense silence between calls, we heard something else. Branches moving and twigs snapping across the creek. All of us froze, our eyes locked on the dense vegetation on the other side. The forest there was thick with magnolias, sweet gums, and pines. "Turn your flashlight that way," I whispered to Mike, who was sitting closest to me. His hand was shaking so badly he dropped it twice before finally managing to point it toward the sound. The beam didn't penetrate far into the darkness, but it was enough for us to see the magnolia limbs shifting. Something was pushing through them, something big. I'll never forget the moment it stepped into the firelight. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was just too wrong, too impossible. Standing across the creek, maybe 20 feet away, was a figure I still struggled to describe accurately. It was huge, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 feet tall. Its shoulders were massive, at least 3 feet wide. The proportions weren't right for a human, but it stood perfectly upright on 2 legs. Its body was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but more like coarse human hair that grew denser in some areas than others. The firelight reflected off its eyes in a way that made them look almost amber-colored. Jake let out this weird choking sound, and Sarah grabbed my arm so tightly I had bruises the next day. Devin completely lost it. He scrambled backward and dove into his tent, making all kinds of noise in his panic. What happened next is the part that still haunts me. This creature barely reacted to Devin's sudden movement. It just slowly turned its head toward the tent, watched for a second, then calmly shifted its gaze back to the rest of us. There was an intelligence in those eyes that I can't explain. It wasn't curious or aggressive or scared. It was evaluating. Then, with deliberate movements, it squatted down by the creek's edge. I could see its massive thighs flexing, its back perfectly straight. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws, reached into the water and began manipulating something. Stones, maybe. I couldn't tell. But the whole time, it kept staring at us, completely unfazed by our presence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I'm not even sure we were breathing. My entire body felt frozen, like in those nightmares where you desperately want to run but can't. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Probably only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The creature continued whatever it was doing in the water, occasionally tilting its head slightly as if considering something. The firelight played across its features, highlighting the contours of its face. It wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The brow was heavy, the jaw pronounced, but there was something undeniably intelligent about its expression. Finally, the spell broke when Mike whispered, "We need to get out of here." That simple statement jolted us into action. We started frantically gathering flashlights and essential gear, trying to move as quickly and quietly as possible. I remember fumbling with my phone, desperate to take a picture, but my hands were shaking too badly to even unlock the screen. The creature seemed to sense our intention to leave. With the same unnerving calmness it had displayed all along, it slowly stood up. Water dripped from its hands as it took a few unhurried steps back toward the tree line. Then, in a movement that defied its size, it simply vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it had melted back into the forest without making a sound. No crashing through underbrush, no branches breaking, nothing. We didn't wait around. Within minutes, we had grabbed our sleeping bags, phones and car keys and were stumbling through the darkness toward the trail that led back to our vehicles. We left everything else behind, tents, coolers, camping gear, all of it. Nobody cared. We just needed to get away. The hike back to our cars was a blur of panic and adrenaline. Every shadow seemed to move, every natural forest sound amplified in our terrified minds. We piled into our vehicles and drove straight through the night, not stopping until we hit the outskirts of Atlanta around dawn. At a 24-hour diner, over cups of coffee none of us could drink, we finally talked about what we'd seen. No one explicitly used the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but we all knew. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't in any wildlife guidebook. It wasn't something that should be squatting by a creek in the Georgia wilderness, watching 5 terrified campers with intelligent, evaluating eyes. What bothers me most, even months later, isn't just that we saw something impossible. It's that I can't shake the feeling that it was studying us. Those calculated calls at precise intervals, the way it positioned itself, across the creek where we could see it clearly, the deliberate movements. It all felt like some kind of test or observation. I haven't been camping since. Mike and Jake have both refused to talk about that night again. Sarah started seeing a therapist. Devin moved to Colorado, saying he needed a change of scenery. None of us filed reports or went public with the story. What would be the point? Who would believe us? Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, calling out every 20 minutes, waiting for someone else to stumble into its testing ground. I wonder if it's disappointed we left so quickly before it could finish whatever it was doing. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have laughed it off as a campfire tale or a hallucination brought on by mushrooms. But 5 people don't share the same hallucination. 5 people don't invent the same details. The amber eyes, the precise timing of those calls, the way it manipulated something in the water while maintaining that unwavering stare. Those woods don't belong to us. They never did. We were visitors there, tolerated perhaps, but never welcome. That thing, whatever it was, had more right to be there than we ever will. It belonged in a way we never could. I still have nightmares where I'm sitting by that creek alone, hearing that call every 20 minutes, knowing it's getting closer, knowing it's coming for me specifically. I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced I can hear branches breaking outside my apartment window. I don't know why I'm sharing this now. Maybe writing it down will help me process it. Maybe someone else has seen it too and can tell me I'm not losing my mind. All I know is that something watches from the woods in Murray County, and it's aware of us in ways we can't understand. Story 4. I still can't sleep properly, and it's been over 3 weeks since it happened. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that sound again. I've lived in northern Minnesota my entire life, raised with the wilderness practically in my backyard. I'm used to animal noises, the yipping of coyotes, wolves howling in the distance, bears rustling through the brush. But what I heard that night was different, wrong, like something that shouldn't exist in our world. Let me back up a bit. I live on a 20-acre property about 40 minutes outside of Duluth with my parents and younger brother. We run a small dog sledding operation with 14 Alaskan Huskies. Our property backs right up against deep forest, the kind that seems to swallow all light once you get more than 100 yards in. In winter, it's just endless white and bare trees as far as you can see. That night, January 16th, I went to bed around 10:30 after feeding the dogs their evening meal. Everything was normal. The temperature had dropped to about 15 below, which isn't unusual for January up here. The dogs were settled in their heated kennel, and the house was quiet except for Dad's TV playing softly downstairs. I fell asleep easily enough, but woke up suddenly at 12:35. I remember checking my phone and seeing the time glowing on the screen. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. The house was completely silent. No wind outside, which was strange in itself, because we usually get at least some breeze through the pines. It was that unnatural stillness that comes before something bad happens, like the air itself was holding its breath. I sat up in bed, my heart already starting to pound, though I didn't know why. My room faces the backyard and the edge of the forest beyond. The moon was nearly full that night, casting everything in this blue-white glow that made the snow look almost luminous. I could see the outline of the kennel about 60 yards from the house, and beyond that, the dark line where the trees began. That's when I heard it. A howl. But not like any wolf or coyote I've ever heard, and trust me, I've heard plenty. This was deeper somehow, like it was coming from something with a chest cavity twice the size of a wolf. It started low and rose to this pitch that made my skin crawl, lasting for about 5 seconds before cutting off abruptly. Then silence for maybe 3 seconds, followed by another howl, identical to the first. The sound seemed to come from just inside the tree line, maybe 100 yards from our property. Close. Too close. As soon as the second howl ended, our dogs lost it. All 14 of them erupted at once, barking, howling, whining. I've been around these dogs my entire life. They're working animals, bred for the cold and the trail. They bark when strangers approach or when they're excited for a run. But this was different. There was panic in their voices, genuine fear. A few of them were making this high-pitched, keening sound I'd never heard before. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass to see better. The kennel was visible in the moonlight, and I could see some of the dogs pacing in their runs, others practically throwing themselves against the chain link. A few had their faces pointed skyward, howling back at whatever was out there. Dad came bursting into my room without knocking, shotgun in hand. "You hear that?" he whispered. coming to stand beside me at the window. I nodded, unable to find my voice for a moment. "What is it?" "Don't know," he said, his voice tight. "Never heard anything like it." We stood there for what felt like forever, just staring out at the woods, listening to our dogs freaking out. Mum and my brother joined us, and we all just waited, watching. After about 10 minutes, the dogs started to calm down a bit, though they were still restless, pacing and whining. We never heard the howl again that night. Dad decided to go check on the dogs, and I insisted on going with him. Mom didn't want either of us out there, but Dad grabbed a second shotgun from the gun safe and handed it to me. The walk to the kennel was the longest 60 yards of my life. The snow crunched under our boots, sounding impossibly loud in the silent night. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, making little clouds with each exhale. I kept looking toward the forest, expecting to see eyes reflecting back in the darkness. The dogs were still agitated when we reached them. Kodiak, our lead dog, was normally the calmest of the bunch, but even he was pacing nervously, his eyes constantly darting to the woods. We checked each dog, making sure none had hurt themselves in their panic. They were physically fine, but clearly spooked. We stayed out there for almost an hour until the dogs had settled enough that we felt comfortable leaving them. Before we went back inside, Dad shined his flashlight toward the woods, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing moved, nothing reflected back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from just beyond where the light could reach. Neither of us slept the rest of the night. We sat in the living room, shotguns across our laps, talking in low voices about what it could have been. Dad suggested maybe a wolf with some kind of injury or disease that distorted its howl. I wasn't convinced. When morning finally came, I decided to check out the woods. Dad didn't want me going alone, but he had to take my brother to school and then head to work himself. Mom was already at her shift at the hospital. I promised I'd take a gun and be careful. I should mention that for years, at least 5, we've been disposing of animal remains in a clearing about 200 yards into the forest behind our property. Nothing weird, just the usual stuff from hunting season. Deer bones, some beaver carcasses from my uncle who traps, fish remains. It's pretty common practice around here. These remains usually attract foxes, coyotes, and other scavengers, which is actually helpful because it keeps them coming to a predictable spot rather than roaming closer to our dogs. After everyone left, I bundled up, grabbed Dad's shotgun, and headed out. The dogs were calmer in the daylight, but still on edge. Several of them whined as I passed, like they were warning me not to go. The snow was about knee-deep, making the walk into the forest slow and tiring. It had been a couple weeks since we'd had fresh snowfall, so the surface was crusty and broke under my weight with each step. I followed our usual path, marked by years of foot traffic and the occasional ribbon tied to tree branches. The disposal clearing is just a small, open area surrounded by pines and birch trees. As I approached, I immediately sensed something was off. The clearing looked arranged. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. Like someone had been organizing things. Under one of the larger pines at the far edge of the clearing, I found something that made my blood run cold. 3 beaver carcasses, ones my uncle had dropped off maybe 2 weeks earlier, were stacked in a neat row. They'd been stripped completely to the bone, which wasn't unusual in itself. What was bizarre was how they were positioned. All 3 skeletons were aligned perfectly, facing the same direction, like they'd been carefully placed that way. I've seen how scavengers work. They drag remains away, scatter them, fight over them. They don't stack them neatly or position them all in the same direction. This was deliberate, intentional. I stood there staring at those beaver skeletons for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe some weird wind pattern had somehow aligned them. Maybe another hunter was messing with us. But I knew better. This was something else entirely. As I stood there, I suddenly became aware of how quiet the forest was. No birds, no squirrels chattering, nothing. Just absolute silence except for my own. Breathing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the trees around me. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted. My eyes were drawn to a massive pine about 30 yards away. I can't explain why, but I was certain something was there, just out of sight, behind that tree. I raised the shotgun instinctively. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding tiny in the vast silence. No response, not even an echo. I don't know what possessed me, but I started walking toward that pine tree. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Each step in the crunching snow seemed impossibly loud. I was about 15 yards away when I noticed them, tracks in the snow, circling around from the other side of the tree. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Canine in shape, but massive, easily twice the size of our largest dog's paws. And there was something off about the gait, the spacing between prints suggesting a stride too long for a normal wolf. I froze, staring at those tracks, when a branch snapped somewhere behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. The clearing was empty, except for those neatly arranged beaver skeletons. That was enough for me. I turned and half ran, half stumbled back through the snow toward home, constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't slow down until I reached the kennel. The dogs were all alert, standing at attention, their eyes fixed on the forest I'd just fled. We didn't hear the howling again that winter. No further unusual incidents disrupted our nights, but something changed after that day. The forest behind our property doesn't feel the same anymore. Sometimes, when I'm out with the dogs for training runs, I'll catch them looking back toward those woods, ears perked, bodies tense. And occasionally, when I'm alone in my room at night, I'll wake up suddenly for no reason, my body alert and listening. I've never told anyone else. About the arranged beaver skeletons. It sounds too crazy, too impossible to explain, but I know what I saw. And I know that whatever made that howl that night, whatever arranged those bones so carefully, it doesn't belong in our world. And I can't shake the feeling that someday, when the conditions are just right, when the night is silent and the moon is bright, I'll hear that howl again. And next time, it might be closer. Story 5. I'm not sure where to start with this one. I've held on to this experience for over 2 years now, telling only a handful of people who I know wouldn't immediately write me off as crazy. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has had a similar experience. I've spent most of my life in the woods. I'm a professional woodsman. I do wildlife surveys, help with conservation projects, and basically make my living being in places most people never set foot in. I'm not easily spooked, and I've encountered just about everything you'd expect in the Pacific Northwest forests. Bears, cougars, you name it. But what I encountered in September 2020 was different. This wasn't my first time seeing it either. I had a brief encounter a few years earlier during hunting season, but I convinced myself it was just a bear standing up, or my eyes playing tricks on me in the low light. This second time left no doubt in my mind. It was a clear day in early September. I had packed enough supplies for a long day hike, about 10 hours, into the deep forest east of Forks, Washington. This isn't tourist country. There are no well-maintained trails or signs. I'm talking about proper wilderness, wetlands, thick timber, and terrain that changes from dense forest to sudden ravines without warning. I'd pushed about 7 miles in, following game trails and occasionally checking my GPS to maintain a general heading. The forest was unusually quiet that day. You know how sometimes the woods just feel different? No bird calls, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush, just that heavy silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I was about 3 hours into my hike when I first noticed something wasn't right. It wasn't a sound that alerted me. It was a sensation of movement in my peripheral vision. You develop a sort of sixth sense when you spend enough time outdoors. Something was tracking me. At first I thought it might be a black bear, or maybe even a cougar curious about the human in its territory, but the way it moved wasn't right for either animal. It stayed within the thick brush, always hidden, but I could see a large shape shifting through the shadows. What really got to me was how it matched my movements exactly. When I walked, it walked. When I stopped, it stopped. Instead of panicking, I decided to study it. I established a pattern, walking slowly for about 50 yards, then kneeling as if examining something on the ground. Each time I knelt, I'd use my peripheral vision to try to get a better look without making it obvious I had spotted it. The thing, and I'm still reluctant to call it what I think it was, would crouch down when I did, sometimes mimicking my movements by pawing at the forest floor or shifting its weight. It was clearly intelligent, clearly watching me, clearly making decisions about how to move and when. I noticed it would frequently lift its head, almost like it was sniffing the air to catch my scent. The wind was in my favor that day, blowing from the creature toward me, which probably explains why it kept its distance at first. This bizarre interaction continued for nearly an hour. I kept walking, stopping, pretending to study the ground, all while keeping track of my shadow companion. Then something happened that genuinely unsettled me. The creature repositioned itself about 75 yards to my right, essentially flanking me with incredibly silent, careful movement. If you know anything about predator behavior, you'll understand why this made me uneasy. It reminded me of how coyotes track wounded prey. One distracts from the front while others move to the sides. It was a tactical shift that displayed worrying intelligence. I continued heading southeast through the forest, maintaining my 50-yard walking pattern. My heart was pounding, but I kept my exterior calm. Years of wilderness experience taught me that showing fear is never a good idea around wild animals. I kept my movements deliberate and non-threatening. Eventually, I spotted the creature again, this time much closer, maybe 30 yards away. It was hiding behind the massive root system of a fallen old-growth tree. From this vantage point, I could see its dark eyes and the right side of its face through a gap in the roots. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. They were animal-like, similar to a white-tailed deer's, dark with no visible whites. But there was something in them, a kind of awareness that went beyond animal instinct. It was studying me as much as I was studying it. The creature and I continued this strange dance for another 30 minutes. I was approaching a large clearing created by some recent logging activity when it suddenly vanished. 1 minute it was there, watching from behind a thicket of salal bushes, and the next, it was gone. No sound, no movement I could detect, just gone. I waited in the area for about an hour, partly hoping it would reappear, partly because I needed to collect myself. My hands were shaking as I took out my water bottle, not from fear exactly, but from the adrenaline and the weight of what I'd just experienced. During this second encounter, I was able to observe more details than my first brief sighting years ago. The creature stood about 6 to 6.5 feet tall, not the 8 or 9 feet you hear in some stories. It had dark brown hair with black streaks in a pattern that reminded me of brindle coloring on dogs. When it moved, it walked with a hunched ape-like posture. Throughout the entire encounter, it never made a sound, not a grunt, not a snort, nothing. And contrary to the stories you hear, I detected no odor from it, though I was downwind most of the time. What struck me most was its behavior. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't timid either. It seemed curious, aware, and possibly even tracking me in return. The intelligence behind its movements was undeniable. I've spent my life in these woods. I know what bears look like, even standing up. I know what people in ghillie suits look like. This was neither. Having seen it twice now in remote areas miles apart, but within the same region, I no longer have any doubt about what I encountered. The skeptic in me wants to find some rational explanation, but I can't. No human would move that way, with that fluid, animal grace. No known animal in these forests has that body structure or behaves with that level of calculated intelligence. When I finally left the clearing and headed back toward my truck, I felt different. The forest that had been my second home for decades suddenly felt foreign. Every shadow concealed potential watchers. Every rustle in the underbrush made me stop and scan my surroundings. I made it back to my vehicle just as dusk was settling in. The entire drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the tree line behind me. That night, I pulled out maps of the area and marked the locations of both sightings. They were approximately 3 miles apart in similarly remote terrain, areas with permanent water sources, abundant cover, and minimal human presence. The perfect habitat for something that doesn't want to be found. In the days that followed, I researched similar encounters in the Olympic Peninsula region. There were more than I expected, dating back decades. Many described the same behaviors I'd witnessed: the silent observation, the mirroring of movements, the strategic positioning. I've gone back to those woods many times since then. I have to. It's my livelihood. But I go with a different awareness now. I'm always scanning, always listening. Sometimes I leave my truck in the morning and find strange prints around it when I return. Not clear enough to photograph or cast, just depressions in the soft ground that don't match any known wildlife. Last month, I was working about 5 miles from my second sighting location. I had the distinct feeling of being watched again. I called out, something I hadn't done during either encounter, and heard branches breaking as something large moved rapidly away through the forest. It could have been a deer or elk, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. I don't know what to do with this experience. I'm not looking to prove anything to anyone. I know what I saw. I know it's out there. And I'm pretty certain it knows me now too. I've spent my entire adult life in these forests, comfortable with solitude and the company of wildlife. Now, even on the brightest days, I feel like I'm never truly alone out there. There's a presence that watches, follows, studies. Sometimes I wonder what it wants, why it's so interested in humans who venture into its territory. I still go into the woods alone, but I'm more cautious now. I stay alert in a way I never had to before. And sometimes, when the forest goes quiet and that prickling sensation crawls up my spine, I know it's nearby, watching me from the shadows, just as curious about me as I am about it. The next time it happens, I'm not sure if I'll back away or try to make contact. Part of me wants answers, but another part knows some mysteries of the forest might be better left unexplored. Story 6. I've been sitting on this for 17 years, and I'm still not sure if I should be sharing it. But after seeing those recent sightings near Prince Albert National Park last month, I need to get this off my chest. What we saw wasn't normal, and I'm tired of pretending it was. It happened on April 14th, 2006. I'll never forget that date because it was the day before my birthday, and we were wrapping up 3 weeks of field research on wolf populations in northern Saskatchewan. I was 32 then, working as a wildlife biologist with the Provincial Conservation Department. There were 4 of us in the department truck: myself, my supervisor Martin, and 2 field techs, Darren and Kayla. We'd spent the morning collecting hair samples from snares about 20 kilometers east of Green Lake. It was unseasonably warm for mid-April, maybe around 15 degrees Celsius, with that fresh spring smell in the air after the winter thaw. The kind of day that makes you roll down your windows, even though it's not quite warm enough. We were heading back to our motel around 4 in the afternoon, driving south on Highway 155. Martin was behind the wheel. I was in the passenger seat reviewing field notes, and Darren and Kayla were in the back, half asleep after the long day. We were all exhausted but satisfied with our data collection. The sun was still high and the road was pretty much empty, just us and the occasional car passing in the other direction. That part of Saskatchewan is incredibly remote. Miles of boreal forest stretching in every direction, broken only by the occasional lake or bog. The kind of wilderness that makes you feel small. We were about 15 kilometers south of Green Lake, moving at around 90 kilometers per hour. I remember I was making notes about a possible wolf den site we'd flagged for follow-up when Martin suddenly hit the brakes. Not hard enough to throw us forward, but enough that I looked up from my clipboard. "What the hell is that?" he said, slowing the truck down to maybe 30 kilometers per hour. At first, I thought it was a moose. We'd seen plenty that week, and they sometimes dart across the highway. But as my eyes focused on the figure moving through the ditch on the right side of the road, I realized immediately this was something else entirely. It was already moving away from us, having apparently just crossed the road before we came around the bend. The first thing that struck me was the color, a deep reddish brown like rust or cinnamon covering its entire body. And the size, my God, the size. I've worked with bears my entire career, and this thing dwarfed any black bear I'd ever documented. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. "Stop the truck," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Martin had already slowed to about 20 kilometers per hour, and now he eased onto the shoulder. By now, Darren and Kayla were fully alert, both pressing against the right side windows. "Is that a bear?" Kayla asked. She was newer to fieldwork, having joined our team just 6 months prior. "No," I said immediately. "That's not a bear." The creature was bipedal, walking on 2 legs with a stride that covered an impossible amount of ground. Each step it took was like 3 of what a human would make. It moved with purpose, leaning slightly forward with each powerful stride, arms swinging at its sides. The arms, they hung lower than a human's would, almost to the knee. The hands looked massive, even from our distance. The creature's back and shoulders were broad, tapering to a narrower waist. The head sat directly on those shoulders, with barely any visible neck. "Get the camera," I hissed to Darren, not taking my eyes off the figure. "It's under my seat." I heard him fumbling, but I couldn't look away to help. The creature was already reaching the tree line, maybe 100 meters from the road now. It moved with such deliberate grace for something so large, pushing aside saplings like they were blades of grass. Just then, I noticed a green caravan that had been behind us also pulling over. There were faces pressed against their windows too. They were seeing it. This wasn't mass hallucination or trick of the light. Darren finally got the camera out, but by then, the creature had reached the denser part of the forest. The last thing I saw clearly was its massive shoulder and the back of its head as it disappeared into the shadows between the trees. The entire sighting lasted maybe 20 seconds. We sat there in silence for what felt like forever. "Did you get anything?" I finally asked Darren. He shook his head. "Just the trees where it went in. It was too fast." Martin put the truck in park and we all got out. The people from the caravan, a middle-aged couple and their teenage son, approached us. "Did you see that?" the man asked, his face pale. "What the hell was that thing?" "I'm not sure," I said, though in my mind I was already processing what I'd seen against every animal native to Saskatchewan. We stood on the shoulder of the highway, all 7 of us, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. No one wanted to approach the tree line. There was a weight to the air, a feeling that we were being watched from the shadows. "We should report this," the woman from the caravan said. "Should we call the police?" Martin shook his head. "And tell them what? That we saw something big go into the woods. They'll think we're nuts." He was right. Without evidence, this was just another unverifiable wildlife sighting in a remote area. But I knew what I'd seen wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. It wasn't a moose with light playing tricks. The way it moved, the deliberate, powerful strides, belonged to something that was naturally bipedal. We exchanged contact information with the family from the caravan. They were from Edmonton, passing through on their way to visit relatives in La Ronge. They seemed shaken, but also excited in that way people get when they experience something extraordinary. The father kept saying, "No one's going to believe this," while the teenage son was already crafting the story he'd tell his friends. After they left, my team and I walked to the edge of the road where we believed the creature had crossed. The ground in the ditch was still partially frozen in spots, but thawed and muddy in others. And there they were, impressions in the mud that made my skin crawl. Footprints, but not from any animal I recognized. They were huge, easily 15 inches long, and showed what looked like 5 toes. Not bear tracks, not human tracks either. The stride between them was immense, easily 7 or 8 feet apart. "Take photos of these," I told Darren, who still had the camera, "and we need something for scale." Kayla placed her field notebook next to one of the clearer prints, while Darren snapped several pictures. The impressions weren't deep enough to make casts, and they were already starting to fill with water. "What do you think it was?" Kayla asked me quietly, while Darren photographed the evidence. I hesitated. In my 17 years as a wildlife biologist, I'd encountered nearly every large mammal in North America. I'd tracked wolves through winter forests, documented grizzlies in Yellowstone, even assisted with mountain lion research in British Columbia. Nothing in my experience matched what we'd just seen. "I don't know," I finally admitted, "but it wasn't anything in our field guides." Martin overheard us. "We need to be careful how we report this," he said. "The department doesn't look kindly on unsubstantiated claims." He was right. Wildlife biology is a science built on observable, measurable phenomena. Our careers depended on our credibility. Claiming to have seen something that most of academia would dismiss as folklore could be professional suicide. We spent another 20 minutes searching the area where the creature had entered the forest. The ground there was covered with a thick layer of pine needles and moss that didn't hold tracks well. About 10 meters in, the forest became too dense to follow easily. Without proper equipment, none of us was eager to pursue further anyway. The drive back to the motel was unnervingly quiet. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, processing what we'd seen. I kept replaying the creature's movement in my mind, that purposeful stride, the way it navigated the uneven terrain with such ease. There was intelligence in its movement, a familiarity with the landscape that spoke of something that belonged there more than we did. Back at the motel, we gathered in Martin's room with our field notebooks. The photos Darren had taken of the footprints were clear enough, but without something immediately identifiable next to them for scale, they could be dismissed as anything. Bear tracks distorted by meltwater or even elaborate hoaxes. "So what do we do with this?" Darren asked, gesturing to his camera. Martin sighed. "We document it like any other observation. Species unknown, estimated height 8 feet, bipedal locomotion, reddish-brown pelage, location, date, time, weather conditions, just the facts." "And when they ask what we think it was?" Kayla pressed. "We say we don't know," Martin replied firmly, "because we don't." But I did know, or at least I had a theory that I wasn't ready to voice out loud. Growing up in rural Manitoba, I'd heard the stories. Everyone in these parts has. Tales of Sasquatch, Wendigo, or as the Cree called it, Mississippi, the great lynx. Folklore, most scientists would say. Cultural memories dressed up as monsters. Except I'd just seen something that shouldn't exist according to every textbook I'd studied and taught from. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure disappearing into the trees. I kept wondering, where was it going? Was there somewhere deeper in that vast forest that it called home? Were there others? The next morning, my birthday, we returned to the site before continuing our journey back to Regina. The tracks had been washed away by an overnight rainfall. There was no evidence anything unusual had crossed the highway. Part of me was relieved. It meant we wouldn't have to defend our credibility. Part of me was disappointed. Without evidence, the experience would fade into just another unexplained story. When we filed our report back at the department, we included the incident as a footnote, an unidentified large mammal sighting with the photos attached. As expected, It was met with skepticism and eventually filed away. The prevailing theory among our colleagues was that we'd seen a moose in poor light conditions, or perhaps a black bear with some kind of mange that affected its appearance and behavior. I tried contacting the family from Edmonton a few weeks later, but the number they'd given me was disconnected. I've often wondered if they told their story, and if they too were met with disbelief. Over the years, I've researched similar sightings across Canada. There are more than you'd think, especially in the vast boreal forests that stretch across our northern provinces. Most witnesses don't come forward publicly. Who would risk their reputation? But in private conversations over beers at conferences, I've heard other biologists, forest rangers, and guides share their own unexplainable encounters. The vastness of Canada's wilderness staggers the imagination. The boreal forest alone covers over 550 million hectares. That's larger than the entire country of India. We've mapped it, sure, but truly explored? Not even close. The deepest parts of those forests might as well be as unknown as the bottom of the ocean. 17 years have passed since that April afternoon outside Green Lake. I've advanced in my career, published papers, gained respect in my field. I've never publicly spoken about what we saw, but I think about it every time I'm in the field, every time I look into a dense stand of trees. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose. It was something that moved with strength and purpose through territory. It knew intimately. Something that has every right to remain hidden from us in the vast spaces we've yet to truly understand. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it saw us too. Just another group of curious primates, documenting and categorizing, trying to make sense of a world that will always hold mysteries beyond our comprehension. Story 7. I never wanted to share this story. For years, I've kept it to myself, partly because I knew no one would believe me, and partly because the experience felt so personal, so profound, that putting it into words seemed impossible. But I can't stop thinking about what happened, and maybe writing it down will help me process it. This happened during the summer of 2018, right after that massive drought we had in Colorado. I'm an experienced backpacker, been doing solo trips for almost 15 years now, but this trip was special because I wasn't alone. I had my 4-pack goats, Samson, Bucky, Titan, and Clover, and my 2 border collies, Ranger and Timber. Ranger was my old boy, 9 years old and steady as a rock. Timber was younger, just 3, still learning but smart as hell. My plan was ambitious but nothing I hadn't done before. Hiking the Colorado Trail from Spring Creek Pass, with the possibility of making it all the way to Durango before looping into the Weminuche Wilderness. I'd mapped everything out, planned my resupply points, and was well prepared for a 3-week journey. The first 2 days went smoothly. The weather was perfect, cool mornings, warm afternoons, and clear nights for stargazing. The animals were in great spirits, and I felt that familiar sense of freedom that only comes when you're miles from civilization with everything you need on your back. On the 3rd day, things changed. We'd stopped at a creek around midday so the animals could drink and rest. About an hour after we got back on the trail, I noticed Clover, my youngest goat, was lagging behind. Her ears were drooping, and she wasn't showing her usual curiosity about our surroundings. When we stopped again, she refused to eat and just lay down. I checked her temperature, slightly elevated. Nothing immediately alarming, but enough that I decided to find a place to camp early and keep an eye on her. We were near Jarosa Mesa, and I knew there were some good camping spots off the main trail. I decided to veer off route to find somewhere quiet where we could stay for a couple of days if necessary. After about an hour of careful hiking, we came upon this perfect meadow, maybe 3 acres of open space, surrounded by thick timber, with a small spring on one edge providing fresh water. It was secluded, peaceful, and exactly what we needed. I set up camp near the edge of the meadow where I could see both the open space and the tree line, got the tent up, secured a perimeter for the goats, and started monitoring Clover more closely. She seemed a bit better by evening, drinking water and nibbling at some feed, which was reassuring. That first night passed uneventfully, but I noticed something odd the next morning. The animals were behaving strangely. The dogs would suddenly become alert, ears perked up, staring intently at the forest edge. The goats would bunch together, stop grazing and freeze. Then, just as suddenly, they'd relax and go back to normal. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that animals sense things long before humans do, so I paid attention. I patrolled our perimeter several times that day, looking for signs of predators. Found some old bear scat, but nothing fresh. No mountain lion tracks, no fresh bear prints, nothing that should have been causing their unease. Still, I kept my bear spray closer than usual and made sure my small caliber pistol was loaded. I only carry it for emergencies. Clover seemed almost back to normal by afternoon, which was a relief. I decided we'd stay one more night to make sure she was fully recovered before getting back on the trail. As the day progressed, the animals' behavior became increasingly erratic. They'd be calm one minute, then suddenly on edge the next. Ranger, who's normally unflappable, stayed unusually close to me. As dusk settled over the meadow, I finished my dinner, a simple freeze-dried meal heated over my small stove. The light was fading, that blue-gray twilight when visibility starts to get tricky. I just cleaned up and was about to head into my tent when the animals suddenly went on high alert. All 4 goats froze, staring in the same direction toward the eastern tree line. Timber gave a short, sharp bark, but Ranger, this is what got me, Ranger let out this low, quiet growl. Now, I need to explain something about Ranger. He's a protective dog, well trained for backcountry travel. When we encounter minor threats, other hikers, deer, even smaller predators, he'll bark and position himself between me and whatever he perceives as dangerous. The only time he makes that specific low growl is when we've encountered serious threats, like the time we surprised a black bear with cubs, or when a mountain lion stalked our camp in the Sangre de Cristos. That growl means big danger, stay still, don't provoke. I grabbed my pepper spray and slowly emerged from the tent. The goats were bunched together, trembling slightly, all looking in the same direction. Following their gaze, I saw nothing at first, just the darkening edge of the forest about 30 yards away. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I realized there was something there. Standing just at the tree line, partially obscured by the gathering darkness and a cluster of young aspens, was a figure. My first thought was, bear standing upright, but immediately I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't stand like that, not for extended periods. This figure was fully upright, bipedal, and massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing towered over what I would estimate to be around 8 feet. It was covered in hair, not fur exactly, but hair, a reddish-brown chestnut color that caught what little light remained. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear. The shoulders were broader, the arms longer, hanging at its sides. The face, God, the face is what I remember most clearly. It had less dense hair around the eyes, which were completely brown, no whites visible, and set deep under a prominent brow ridge. I stood there, pepper spray half raised, frozen in place. It wasn't fear exactly, though I was terrified. It was something else, a kind of primal recognition, like my body knew exactly what I was looking at, even if my mind couldn't process it. Neither of us moved. Despite my fear, I never felt threatened, not directly. There was no aggression in its posture. It seemed as surprised to see me as I was to see it. We must have stayed like that for at least 2 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then it made a sound, a low, rumbling vocalization that wasn't quite a growl. It was almost conversational. That's when I noticed movement behind it and realized there was a second figure, slightly smaller but similar in appearance, partially hidden by the trees. The first one turned its head slightly toward the second, made another soft vocalization, and then both of them turned away. They didn't run exactly. It was a kind of loping movement, powerful and ground-eating. I swear I could feel the vibration through the soles of my boots as they moved away. Within seconds, they had disappeared into the darkening forest. I stood there for what must have been 10 minutes, unable to move, pepper spray still in my hand. Ranger stayed pressed against my leg, no longer growling but clearly on alert. The goats gradually relaxed, though they stayed bunched together for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. How could I? I sat up all night with my headlamp and pistol, though I never felt they would return. Something about that encounter felt complete, like we had acknowledged each other and that was enough. At first light, I packed up camp. Before leaving, I searched the tree line for tracks or evidence. The ground was dry and hard-packed. I found nothing conclusive, some depressions that might have been footprints, but nothing clear enough to photograph or measure. Part of me was relieved. What would I have done with proof? Here's the strangest part. I didn't leave because I was afraid. I left because I felt like I was intruding. That meadow, that section of forest, it felt like I had inadvertently walked into someone else's home. Someone who had been there long before me, who belonged there in a way I never would. I got back on the trail that day and continued my hike, though I cut it short and exited at the next opportunity 4 days later. I never reported what I saw. What would I say? To whom? That I saw a Sasquatch. 2 of them. I'd be labeled a kook, another hiker with a wild story. But I know what I saw. I've spent my life in the outdoors. I know every large animal native to the Colorado wilderness. This was something else entirely. It's been 5 years now, and I've returned to backcountry hiking many times, though never to that specific area. The animals still accompany me, except for Ranger, who passed away last year. Sometimes when we're deep in the wilderness and the night is particularly still, I notice the goats and timber staring into the darkness with unusual intensity. In those moments, I wonder if they sense something I can't, and I remember that evening in the meadow. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if someone else told me this story. But it happened, exactly as I've described it. And it changed something fundamental in how I view the wilderness, not as empty space waiting for human exploration, but as home to things we've forgotten how to see. Je suis story 8. I've been holding this in for so long that sometimes I wonder if I dreamed the whole thing. But I didn't. It happened in November of 1941, and I remember it clear as day, even though I'm an old man now. I was 17 then, just a kid really, living near Gypsumville in Manitoba. It was getting cold that November, patches of snow already on the ground, but not enough to keep me from going hunting. My family needed the meat, and I figured I could bring down a moose that would feed us for months. I didn't have a hunting license, couldn't afford one, but that didn't stop me. When you're hungry, rules seem less important. That morning, I grabbed my Winchester .38-55 rifle, the one my grandfather had left me. It wasn't fancy, but it was reliable, and I knew how to use it. I headed out before dawn, making my way toward Basket Lake, about 15 miles west of town. It was a good spot for moose, especially that time of year. The forest was quiet, except for the crunch of the patchy snow under my boots, and my own breathing making little clouds in the cold air. I'd been tracking for maybe 3 hours when I spotted fresh moose droppings and broken branches. Something big had passed through recently. Around midday, I finally spotted her, a decent-sized cow moose. She was about 80 yards away, partially hidden behind some trees. I took careful aim and fired. I know I hit her, but not well enough. She bolted, crashing through the underbrush, leaving a trail of blood drops on the snow and broken twigs. I followed her blood trail for what must have been another hour. The forest got denser, mostly willows that were so thick in places I had to push my way through. The blood spots were getting bigger, which told me she was slowing down. I was getting excited, thinking I'd find her soon. Then, through a gap in the willows, I saw what I thought was the back end of the moose. Just a dark shape, partially obscured. I could only see what I figured was the hindquarters. I decided to take another shot, aiming just above where I thought the anus would be, hoping to hit the spine or vital organs. I squeezed the trigger and heard the satisfying thud of the bullet hitting flesh. There was a heavy sound, like something large collapsing. No thrashing, no noise, just a thump. I waited a few minutes, making sure it was dead. The last thing I wanted was to approach a wounded moose. Those things can kill you with their hooves if they're hurt and scared. When I was convinced it wasn't moving, I pushed through the willows toward where it had fallen. What I saw next. God, I still get cold all over thinking about it. It wasn't a moose. Lying there on its side was... I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was like a man, but not a man. A massive hair-covered thing. Human-shaped, but all wrong. Too big, way too big. I stopped dead in my tracks, my rifle half raised. For a second I thought maybe it was a bear, but no, the proportions were all wrong. It had arms and legs like a person. One arm was pinned beneath its body, the other bent at the elbow with the hand palm down on the ground. My bullet had hit it right between the shoulder blades. It must have died instantly. There was some blood, but not much, just a dark stain on the thick hair. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Part of me wanted to run, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. What the hell was this thing? Finally, I worked up the courage to move closer. My hands were shaking so bad I had to grip my rifle tight to steady them. I nudged one of its feet with my boot. It was solid, real. This wasn't some hallucination. I walked around it slowly, taking in the size. It was enormous. I'm not a small guy. I was about 5'10" then, but this thing made me feel tiny. It had to be at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe even 8. And it wasn't just tall, it was thick. The chest was like a barrel, and the shoulders and back were massively built, way more muscular than any man I'd ever seen. The whole body was covered in dark brown hair, sort of like a bear's, but different. In some places, especially where the sun hit it, I could see reddish highlights. The hair wasn't uniform in length. It varied from maybe an inch in some spots to what looked like 8 inches on the head, shoulders, and arms. Using my boot, I carefully flipped over one of its hands. That's when it really hit me that this wasn't any animal I knew. The hand was massive, but shaped like a human's, with 5 fingers, including a thumb. The palm was a dirty brownish-white color, hairless, but proportionally bigger than a person's hand should be. The fingers were thick, with fingernails that looked almost like blunt claws. I forced myself to look at its face, and that's when the real fear set in. It wasn't exactly human, but it wasn't fully animal either. The face had a strange, almost cat-like quality to it. The nose was flat, not protruding like a human's. It had a short upper lip, and it seemed like it didn't have much of a chin. The teeth I could see looked humanish, but bigger, stronger. The eyes were closed, thank God. I don't think I could have handled seeing its eyes. Its feet were something else, huge and flat, probably 15 inches long at least. They were proportioned like human feet, but much larger, with 5 toes that had thicker nails than a person's. As I stood there looking at this thing, a horrible realization washed over me. I had killed something that was partly human, or at least something closer to human than any animal, and I'd done it while hunting illegally. My mind started racing through all the trouble I could be in. Would they think I murdered someone? Would I go to jail? What the hell was this creature anyway? Panic took over. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, taking what felt like 3-foot strides, crashing through the brush without any care for the noise I was making or the branches whipping at my face. I just needed to be away from that thing. I don't remember much about the trip back home. It's all a blur of running, walking, then running again whenever the image of that creature popped back into my head. By the time I got home, it was getting dark. My parents asked where the moose was, and I mumbled something about missing my shot. I couldn't eat dinner that night, couldn't sleep either. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that thing getting up and following me home. In my dreams, it would stand outside my window, staring in with eyes I never actually saw. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced it was coming for me. I told no one about what happened. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd think I was making up stories to cover for some terrible crime. So I kept quiet and tried to forget. Years passed. I grew up, got married, had kids. I never went hunting in that area again. Actually, I pretty much gave up hunting altogether after that. Couldn't stomach it anymore. Then, in the late 1960s, I saw something on television that made my blood run cold. It was that famous film, the Patterson-Gimlin footage of Bigfoot. The creature walking across that creek bed in California looked so much like what I'd shot that I nearly passed out right there in my living room. My wife asked what was wrong, but I just said I felt dizzy. That's when I knew I had killed a Sasquatch, a goddamn Bigfoot. Back in 1941, before most people had even heard of such things. I started reading everything I could find about Bigfoot sightings. The descriptions matched what I saw: the height, the build, the hair. It was both terrifying and strangely validating. I hadn't been crazy. This was a real creature that other people had seen too. But I still kept quiet. The few times I tried to hint at it to friends, they laughed it off. "Old Pete's been hitting the bottle again," they'd say. So I buried it deep, this secret I'd been carrying. It wasn't until I was nearly 80 that I finally told the whole story to someone who took me seriously. A researcher named Kurt Nelson from some Bigfoot organization contacted me after hearing rumors in my community. By then, I'd started opening up a bit, telling parts of my story to a few trusted people. Mostly they thought I was just an old man with wild tales, but word got around. Kurt listened without judgment. He asked detailed questions, took notes, and seemed to genuinely believe me. It was like a weight lifting off my shoulders after all those years. The thing that still haunts me most is the size of it. You can hear descriptions, see footage, but until you're standing next to something that massive and human-like, you can't understand the impact it has on you. It's like your brain can't process what you're seeing. Everything you thought you knew about what exists in the world just shatters. And then there's the guilt. I killed it. It wasn't threatening me. It wasn't charging. It was just there. And I shot it because I thought it was something else. Sometimes I wonder if it had a family, if others of its kind were waiting for it to come home, just like my family had been waiting for me to bring back a moose that day. I'm an old man now. Most people who hear my story still don't believe me, and that's fine. I know what I saw. I know what I did. And on cold November nights, when the wind blows just right, I still feel like I'm standing there in those willows, looking down at something that shouldn't exist but does. I've never been back to that spot near Basket Lake. Never wanted to. But I often wonder if its bones are still there, buried under decades of forest growth. The only physical proof that would validate my story, slowly turning to dust in the Manitoba wilderness. Debussy, Story 9. See, I've never been the type to believe in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff. My wife Linda used to watch those Bigfoot shows, and I'd always tease her about it. Come on, if these things were real, we'd have definitive proof by now. I was so sure of myself. But after what happened last summer in Allegheny National Forest, I don't joke about it anymore. I don't sleep well either. We'd been planning this camping trip for months. Me, Linda, and our 3 kids, Jake, 14, Emma, 11, and Mia, 8. The kids had been begging for a real wilderness experience instead of our usual vacations to visit relatives or theme parks. Linda and I thought it would be good for them to disconnect from their devices and experience nature. I'm writing this down now because I need to process what happened, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. We arrived at Allegheny On July 5th, 2013, the first few days were perfect, hiking during the day, fishing in the afternoons, and campfires with s'mores at night. The kids were having a blast, and even though cell service was spotty at best, nobody complained. We picked a somewhat secluded campsite, about half a mile from the nearest occupied site. I liked the privacy, the chance to really feel like we were experiencing nature without other campers right on top of us. Looking back, I realized there were warning signs we ignored. On our third night, Linda mentioned feeling like we were being watched while she was gathering kindling near the edge of our campsite. I brushed it off. Probably just a deer. That same evening, Jake said he heard weird noises while we were sitting around the campfire. But kids get spooked easily in the woods, so I didn't think much of it. On July 8th, our second to last day, things started getting strange. We kept finding our trash disturbed in the morning, even though I'd secured it properly. I blamed raccoons or maybe a black bear, which wasn't unusual for the area. But when we returned from a hike that afternoon, our cooler had been moved about 10 feet from where we'd left it. The latch was still secure, so nothing got into our food, but it definitely hadn't been where we left it. I told myself maybe we remembered wrong, or maybe a ranger had moved it while checking sites. That evening, while we were cooking dinner, small objects, pine cones, small sticks, kept landing near our campsite from the direction of the woods. I thought it was just falling from trees, but they seemed to be coming from different directions. The kids found it funny, making up stories about forest fairies playing tricks on us. Linda wasn't laughing, though. "David, I really don't like this," she whispered when the kids weren't listening. "It feels deliberate." I put on a brave face. "It's just the wind, or maybe some squirrels up in the trees," I said, but I was starting to feel uneasy too. We went to bed earlier than usual that night. Our setup was simple: a large family tent for Linda and me, plus our youngest, Mia, and a smaller tent right next to ours for Jake and Emma. I remember having trouble falling asleep, listening to every little sound outside. Then came July 9th. I'll never forget that date. I jolted awake at what my watch said was 4:03 in the morning. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, something moving around our campsite. My first thought was raccoons getting into our trash again, but as I became more alert, I realized the sounds were too heavy, too deliberate for small animals. I sat up slowly, trying not to wake Linda or Mia. That's when I heard the first vocalization, a deep, guttural grunt that didn't sound like any animal I recognized from my years of camping and hunting. It wasn't a bear's growl or a coyote's howl, it was something else entirely. Then came the response, from the opposite side of our campsite. Another, similar grunt, but slightly different in pitch. They were communicating with each other. Whatever they were, there were at least two of them, and they were surrounding us. My blood ran cold when I felt the ground beneath our tent vibrate. Something massive was walking around us, something heavy enough to make the earth tremble with each step. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a black bear, a really big one, but deep down I knew no bear in Pennsylvania would cause that kind of impact. Linda stirred beside me. "David," she whispered, fear evident in her voice. "What's that noise?" "Shh," I whispered back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just stay still." The footsteps circled our tent, slow and methodical. Whatever it was, stopped just behind the thin fabric wall next to our heads. I could hear deep, heavy breathing, in and out, in and out. It smelled awful, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it could hear it. My kids were in the next tent over. If this thing decided to attack, without thinking it through, I shouted as loudly and aggressively as I could, "Hey, get out of here!" It was pure instinct. Make noise, scare it away, protect my family. For a split second, there was complete silence. Then all hell broke loose. The ground shook violently as at least two massive entities stomped away from our campsite. It wasn't the startled scamper of a bear or deer. It was heavy, powerful strides, moving with purpose. I heard branches breaking, vegetation being crushed under incredible weight. And those vocalizations again, urgent now, almost angry-sounding grunts and calls between them as they retreated. "Dad?" Jake's terrified voice came from the other tent. "What's happening?" "Everyone get dressed now," I ordered, already pulling on my jeans and shoes. "We're getting to the car." Linda was shaking so badly she could barely help Mia with her shoes. I grabbed our flashlight and unzipped the tent, peering out cautiously. Dawn was still hours away, and our campsite was pitch black, except for the dim glow of our solar lantern. "Stay close to me," I instructed as we all huddled together. The kids were crying silently, and Linda had her arm wrapped protectively around Mia. We practically ran to our SUV, parked about 30 yards from our tents. Once inside with the doors locked, I started the engine and turned on the headlights, illuminating our empty campsite. Nothing visible moved in the woods beyond. "What was it, Dad?" Emma asked between sobs. "Was it a bear?" I hesitated. "I'm not sure, honey, but we're safe now." We sat in the car for nearly an hour, debating what to do. The kids eventually dozed off in the back seat, exhausted from the adrenaline crash. Linda and I spoke in hushed tones. "David, that wasn't a bear," she insisted. "You heard those sounds. You felt how heavy they were." I didn't want to admit what I was thinking. "Maybe it was elk. They can get pretty big." "Elk don't surround a campsite like that. They don't communicate that way. And they definitely don't throw things at a campsite over multiple days." As the initial panic subsided, I started to feel foolish. We'd driven away from our entire camp setup, tent, supplies, everything, and were sitting in a car in the dark. What would we tell the kids in the morning light? That we ran from Bigfoot? "Look," I said finally, checking my watch. It was 5:30 a.m. and the sky was just starting to lighten. "Let's go back and check things out. If there's any sign of danger, we'll leave immediately. But I'm not going to abandon all our gear without at least checking." Linda reluctantly agreed, and we drove the short distance back to our campsite. The kids were still asleep in the back seat, and we decided to leave them there while we investigated. "I'll go first," I said, grabbing the heavy mag light from the glove compartment. "Stay in the car until I signal it's okay." I stepped out cautiously, sweeping the flashlight around. Everything looked normal. Our tents were still standing, nothing appeared disturbed. I walked a few yards toward the tree line, listening intently. Birds were starting their morning songs, which I took as a good sign. If there was a predator nearby, the birds would be silent. I motioned for Linda to join me, and she reluctantly got out of the car. "See? Nothing to worry about," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. We probably just scared off whatever it was. We stood there in the grey pre-dawn light, surveying our campsite, and that's when we heard it, heavy breathing from the woods to our right. Not exertion, just the deep, rhythmic breathing of something very large, trying to remain quiet but unable to completely mask its presence. Before I could react, something came flying through the air and landed with a soft thud at Linda's feet. A stick, about a foot long, thick as my wrist. Not fallen, thrown. Then came that grunting call again, the same one we'd heard earlier, but closer now. It was answered immediately by another from farther back in the woods. "Run!" I didn't even realize I'd shouted it until we were both sprinting back to the car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently as I started the engine and threw it into reverse, waking the kids with our panicked return. "What's happening?" Jake asked, instantly alert. "We're leaving," Linda said firmly. "Now." We drove to the main road and parked, catching our breath and trying to decide what to do. The sun was starting to rise now, and with the growing light came a sense of safety, however false it might be. "We need our stuff," I said finally. "We can't just leave everything." We agreed to wait until full daylight before returning, and then we'd pack up as quickly as possible and get out of there. The kids were confused and scared, but we didn't tell them everything. Just that we'd heard some animals that might be dangerous and wanted to be cautious. By 7 in the morning, we returned. In the full light of day, with other distant campers starting their morning activities, the forest seemed harmless again. We started packing immediately, working together to break down the tents and load everything into the car. That's when I noticed our trash. The bag had been torn open, but not in the scattered way animals typically ransack garbage. It was opened deliberately, items removed and seemingly examined. Food wrappers were empty but set aside in a neat pile. Non-food items were placed in a different pile. "David, look at this," Linda called from several yards into the woods. I approached cautiously, the kids staying close to the car as we'd instructed them. Linda pointed to a packet of ramen noodles on the ground. It had been carefully opened at one end, the way a person would open it, not torn apart by animal teeth or claws. But the noodles were untouched, as if whatever opened it realized it wasn't immediately edible or decided it didn't want it. "No animal does this," Linda whispered. As we finished packing, I noticed large depressions in the soft ground near where our tents had been. Impressions that hadn't been there the day before. They were roughly oval-shaped, much larger than my boot print, with what looked like toe impressions at one end. We left without eating breakfast, driving straight to Warren, the nearest town. None of us spoke much during the drive. The kids sensed our fear, and I think they knew this wasn't just about normal forest animals. In town, over breakfast at a diner, I finally asked Linda directly, "What do you think it was?" She looked me straight in the eyes. "You know what I think it was. You felt it. You heard it. Those things were watching us our entire trip, and they finally got curious enough to come close." I didn't want to say the word out loud, didn't want to admit that everything I'd scoffed at for years might actually be real. But I couldn't deny what we'd experienced either. That was 8 months ago. We haven't been camping since, and the kids still have nightmares sometimes. I catch myself looking into the trees when we're driving through wooded areas, wondering if we're being watched. I don't tell many people this story. Who would believe it? But I know what we experienced was real. Whatever was in those woods that night wasn't a bear, wasn't an elk, wasn't anything officially recognized by science. It was intelligent, it was curious, and it was massive. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear those grunts echoing in my memory. Story 10. I've never really talked about this online before. I guess because I don't want people to think I'm crazy or just making up stories for attention, but it's been over a decade now, and I still can't shake what happened to me and my buddy Lucas back in those Vermont woods in 2009. I keep thinking maybe someone else has seen what we saw, and maybe sharing my experience might help someone else come forward. We were working as fur trappers that season, something I'd been doing on and off for about 7 years at that point. Lucas was newer to it, only his 2nd year, but he'd grown up hunting with his dad and knew his way around the forests. We'd set up our operation in a remote area outside Montpellier, where we'd had good luck in previous seasons. By late August, we'd already had a decent haul, but that's when things started getting weird. The first time we heard the scream, I honestly thought someone was being murdered. It was around dusk, maybe 6:30 or 7 in the evening. We were at our campsite cooking dinner when this sound cut through the forest. This awful, piercing wail that didn't sound like any animal I knew. Lucas dropped the pan he was holding, and we both just froze, listening. It was so loud that I swear I could feel it in my chest, like when you stand too close to big speakers at a concert. "What the hell was that?" Lucas whispered when it finally stopped. I shook my head. "Maybe a fisher cat? They can sound pretty human sometimes." But I knew damn well it wasn't a fisher cat. It was too powerful, too sustained, and it had this quality to it, almost like it was intelligent, if that makes any sense. Over the next few nights, we kept hearing it, sometimes just once, sometimes multiple times. always in the evening hours, always from different directions. What really unsettled me was how the screams would sometimes shift into this bizarre whistling. Not like human whistling, but musical in a way that felt deliberate and controlled. The sound would carry for miles through the trees. You could track its movement by listening, which meant whatever was making it was covering ground fast. Maybe it's some kind of territorial thing, Lucas suggested one night as we sat by the fire, both of us on edge, waiting for the next scream. Bears sometimes make weird vocalizations to warn off other bears. You ever heard a bear make a sound like that? I asked him. He just shook his head and poked at the fire. About a week before what happened, we found the tracks. We were checking our line on the eastern slope of a pretty steep hill when I noticed something odd in a patch of soft soil near a stream. At first glance, I thought maybe someone else was trapping in our area. I was pissed for a second, thinking about some other guy encroaching on our territory. But when I got closer, I realized these weren't human footprints. At least, not normal ones. They were huge. I measured them with my hunting knife, which is about 9 inches long, and these prints were easily 15 inches from heel to toe. But what really got me was the stride length. These footprints were spaced so far apart, especially considering they were going uphill. I'm 6'2", and when I tried to match the stride, I had to practically jump from one print to the next. "Lucas, come look at this," called over. He crouched down beside me, his face going pale as he studied the tracks. "That's not a bear," he said quietly. "No, it's not. The shape's all wrong." The prints had 5 distinct toes, much like a human foot but broader, with deeper impressions suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We followed the tracks as far as we could until they disappeared into rocky terrain. Neither of us said much on the way back to camp that night. I could tell Lucas was spooked, and honestly, so was I. I'd spent most of my life in these woods and had never seen anything like those prints. For the next few days, we were jumpy as hell. The screams continued each evening, sometimes closer to our camp than before. We started building bigger fires at night and taking turns keeping watch. One night, the screaming seemed to circle our entire camp, as if whatever was making the noise was pacing around us, hidden in the darkness beyond the firelight. Neither of us slept that night. Then came August 26th, 2009. I'll never forget that date. We had decided to check the traps on the western side of our territory, an area we hadn't visited in a few days. It was early afternoon, maybe around 2 o'clock. The day had been strangely quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to have died down completely. That stillness alone was enough to put me on edge. Anyone who spends time in the forest knows it's never truly silent. We were about halfway through our route when I realized I couldn't hear Lucas's footsteps behind me anymore. I turned around and saw him standing stock still, his face drained of color, staring at something off to our right. "Ethan," he whispered, not taking his eyes off whatever he was looking at. "Don't make any sudden movements." I slowly turned my head to follow his gaze, and that's when I saw it. About 100 feet away, partially hidden among the trees, was something I still struggled to describe accurately. It was standing upright, massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was covered in medium-length brown hair, sort of like a bear's coat, but not as thick or shaggy. The hair seemed to thin out around its face, which is the part that still haunts me at night. The face wasn't an animal's face, it was almost human, but wrong somehow. It had a low, sloping forehead, a broad nose, and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. But it was the eyes that really got to me. Small, dark, and completely unblinking. They were fixed on us with an intelligence that no animal should possess. Its body was bulky and powerful, with massive shoulders and thick arms that hung lower than a human's would, ending in enormous hands. I remember thinking those hands could probably crush my skull without effort. And the smell, God, the smell hit us even from that distance. It was this powerful, sour stench like rotting garbage and wet animal fur combined with something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. We stood there, locked in place, staring at each other across that stretch of forest. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Lucas was trembling beside me. I could feel the vibration without even looking at him. Then the creature moved. It took a step forward, its movement oddly fluid despite its bulk, then another step. With each one, I felt my stomach sink further. It opened its mouth and released this deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep inside its chest. The sound was so low it was almost subsonic. I felt it more than heard it. It was a warning, a threat. No animal I've ever encountered has made a sound like that. "Don't run," I whispered to Lucas, not taking my eyes off the creature. "Whatever you do, don't run." The creature took another step toward us, and then it did something I'll never forget as long as I live. It roared. A sound so loud and powerful that I swear I could see the smaller trees around it shaking. Birds exploded from the canopy above us, fleeing in panic. And then it opened its mouth wider, its eyes never leaving ours, and released one of those screams we'd been hearing for weeks. Up close, it was unbearable, like someone dragging metal across my eardrums while simultaneously punching me in the chest. I actually dropped to one knee, my hands instinctively covering my ears. Lucas grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back up. "We need to back away," he said, his voice barely audible over the ringing in my ears. Slowly. We started inching backward, never turning our backs on the creature. It watched us, its head tilting slightly as if curious about our retreat. For a moment I thought it might charge us. I was certain we were about to die in those woods. But after what felt like an eternity, when we'd backed away maybe 30 or 40 feet, the creature suddenly turned and charged up the hillside behind it. Despite its size, it moved with incredible speed, covering ground faster than any human could, especially on that steep terrain. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the thicker forest higher up the slope. We didn't wait around. We ran back to our camp, grabbed only what we absolutely needed, and got the hell out of there. We left traps, equipment, supplies, stuff worth hundreds of dollars, and never went back for any of it. It wasn't worth the risk. I haven't returned to that part of the Vermont forest since that day. Neither has Lucas. We reported what we saw to a local game warden who clearly thought we were either lying or had seen a bear in poor lighting conditions. We didn't push it. What would be the point? But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can still hear that scream echoing in my head. I still wake up in cold sweats, those unblinking eyes staring at me from the darkness of my bedroom. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there in those woods, and I hope to God I never see it again. Story 11. I've been debating whether to share this for years. Even now, typing this out makes my hands feel clammy. It sounds crazy, I know that, but I need to put this somewhere, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened on July 4th, 1984. I was 17 that summer, living in a small town outside Prescott, Arkansas. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and the highlight of the year was the Independence Day celebration at the county fairgrounds. Small town stuff, you know. Fireworks that probably wouldn't impress city folks, but we thought they were amazing. That night had been perfect. Warm, but not humid. Clear sky. Perfect for fireworks. I went with some buddies from school, but halfway through the show, I ended up talking to this girl named Melissa. She wasn't from around here, just visiting her aunt for the summer. We hit it off right away. She had this laugh that made you want to keep making her laugh, if that makes sense. After the fireworks ended and everyone was packing up their lawn chairs and blankets, Melissa mentioned she needed to get back to her aunt's place in Borton, this tiny farming community about 20 minutes away. My friends had already wandered off to find some after-party, so I offered her a ride. I had my dad's Chevy pickup that night, nothing fancy, just an old workhorse with bench seating and windows you had to crank down manually. The drive started off normal. We left the fairgrounds around 11:30, the smell of spent fireworks still hanging in the air. Melissa directed me onto State Route 19, and we chatted about nothing important, summer plans, music, typical teenage stuff. About 10 minutes in, she pointed to a turnoff, a narrow township, road that cut through farmland. "This is a shortcut," she said. I'd never been down this particular road before. It was poorly lit, with just my headlights illuminating the path ahead. The road twisted through patches of woods and cornfields. The radio was playing softly. I remember it was Bruce Springsteen, Dancing in the Dark. Somehow that detail stuck with me. After about 5 minutes on this road, Melissa got quiet. She'd slid closer to me on the bench seat, the way you could in old trucks, and eventually rested her head on my lap. Within minutes, she was asleep. I didn't mind. It was peaceful, just driving with the windows down, the summer night air flowing through, and the occasional flash of distant lightning bugs in the fields. We were probably 15 minutes from her aunt's place when it happened. I was taking a gentle curve, going maybe 30 miles per hour. My headlights swept across the left side of the road where there was a wooden fence separating the road from a cornfield. The corn was about chest high at that time of year. That's when I saw it. Standing just behind the fence was something, someone, a figure, but not normal, not at all. My headlights caught it full on for maybe 3 seconds as I rounded the curve, and I'll never forget what I saw. It was tall, taller than any man I'd ever seen, maybe 7 feet or more, broad across the shoulders and chest. But what made me grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white was that it was covered, head to toe, in hair. Not clothes, hair, light-colored, grayish-white, maybe a dirty off-white in the headlights. The hair wasn't super long, but it covered everything. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, just darker spots where eyes would be, watching me. It was standing completely still, just staring at my truck as I drove past, not moving, not hiding, just observing like it was studying us. I didn't slam on the brakes, I didn't speed up. Honestly, I was too shocked to react at all. I just kept driving at the same speed, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. Was it a person in some kind of suit? Was I seeing things? But it looked so solid, so real in the headlights. When I was past it, I glanced in my rearview mirror. That's when it moved. It turned, its whole body rotating in one fluid motion, and stepped back, disappearing into the cornfield. Just gone. No rustling corn that I could see, no sound, though I probably wouldn't have heard it over the engine and the radio anyway. It just withdrew and vanished. Melissa never stirred. Her breathing stayed even, her head still resting on my lap. I considered waking her, but to tell her what? That I'd seen some hairy monster watching us from a cornfield. I wasn't even sure what I'd seen myself. I drove the rest of the way in a state of high alert, my eyes constantly checking the mirrors, scanning the roadside. My palms were so sweaty they kept slipping on the steering wheel. Every shadow looked like it might be that thing again. My mind raced with possibilities. A bear standing up? No, bears aren't that tall, and they don't stand still like that. A person in a costume, out here in the middle of nowhere at midnight on the 4th of July? When we finally reached her aunt's house, a little farmhouse with the porch light still on, I was so tense my shoulders ached. I gently woke Melissa up, trying to act normal. She thanked me for the ride, asked if I wanted to come in for a soda, but I declined. I needed to get home, to think, to try to make sense of what I'd seen. On the drive back, I took the main roads, no shortcuts. I kept the radio loud and the windows up, even though the night was warm. I didn't want to hear any unexpected sounds from outside. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road behind me. When I got home, my parents were already asleep. I sat in the driveway for maybe 10 minutes, just gathering myself. The house had never looked so normal, so safe. I almost wanted to wake my dad up, tell him what I'd seen, but I knew how that would go. He wasn't the type to believe in anything he couldn't explain with plain common sense. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to convince myself it was something ordinary. A farmer checking his crops maybe, wearing some kind of weird coveralls. But I knew better. No farmer stands motionless behind a fence at midnight. No coveralls look like that, like fur or hair covering an entire body. And the way it moved when it turned away, smooth, deliberate, almost graceful despite its size. I finally broke down and told my closest friend Mike about it a week later. He laughed it off, said I'd probably seen a scarecrow and my mind played tricks on me in the dark. When I insisted, he suggested maybe someone was pulling a prank, dressing up to scare drivers on the back roads. "You know how bored people get around here?" he said. I tried telling a couple other friends, but got similar reactions. One suggested I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed it. Another said I was making it up to sound interesting. After a while, I just stopped talking about it. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I drove back to that spot a few times in the following weeks, always during daylight, always with a friend, claiming I was just exploring back roads. The fence was there, the cornfield was there, but nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken corn stalks, no signs that anything had stood there that night. I even tried to find Melissa again, to casually ask if she remembered anything strange from our drive, but she'd already gone back to whatever city she was from. Her aunt just smiled when I came by, said she'd tell Melissa I'd stop by when she talked to her next. That fall, I left for college in Little Rock, and in some ways, I was glad to put some distance between me and that. A road, but I never forgot. Even now, almost 4 decades later, I can close my eyes and see that figure, tall, broad, covered in that light-colored hair, just watching me drive by. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some descriptions match what I saw, others don't. Most Bigfoot accounts describe dark hair, not the light grayish-white I saw. And Arkansas isn't exactly known for Sasquatch sightings like the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw that night was something else entirely. Not a known animal, not a person, but something different. Something that normally stays hidden but for whatever reason allowed itself to be seen by a 17-year-old kid driving down a back road on the 4th of July. I've never seen anything like it since that night. I've told my wife about it. She's the only one who doesn't immediately try to explain it away. She just listens and says, "Some things in this world don't have easy explanations." I still visit my parents in Arkansas a couple times a year. Sometimes I get this urge to drive down that township road again, to see if it's still there, watching from behind fences or from the edge of fields. I never do, though. Part of me doesn't want to know. The rational part of my brain has tried 1,000 times to explain what I saw. But I know what I saw. I was stone cold sober, wide awake, and it was right there in my headlights, as real as the steering wheel in my hands. Whatever it was watching us that night. And sometimes, when I'm driving on dark country roads, I still check my mirrors, half expecting to see something tall and hair-covered, silently observing from the roadside. Story 12. I've never told this story publicly before. It's been over 30 years, but I still think about it all the time. I'm not some writer or anything, just a normal guy who experienced something I still can't explain. This happened back in '88 when I was 24. My girlfriend Melissa and I had been dating for about 8 months. We were at that stage where we were getting pretty serious, but still having fun and being spontaneous. Our friends Chris and Jen suggested we all go camping together at Palomar Mountain in Southern California. It seemed like a great idea at the time. We were all outdoor people, Not hardcore hikers or anything, but we enjoyed nature, having a few beers around a campfire, that kind of thing. We picked a weekend in late September when the weather would be perfect. Warm days, cool nights. The campground was in a pretty isolated area. You had to drive up this winding mountain road for what felt like forever, and then take this smaller dirt access road to reach it. It wasn't one of those campgrounds with facilities and park rangers driving around, just a few cleared spots where people could set up tents, surrounded by thick pine forest on all sides. When we arrived on Friday afternoon, there was nobody else there, not a single other camper. Chris joked about how we could make as much noise as we wanted, but honestly, the emptiness of the place immediately gave me this weird vibe. It was too quiet, if that makes sense, but I brushed it off. I was with friends, we had plenty of supplies, and it was beautiful up there. We set up our 2 tents about 15 feet apart and got a fire going. That first night was actually really nice. We grilled some burgers, had a few beers, told some stories. Normal camping stuff. I remember looking up at the stars that night and thinking how amazingly clear they were, away from all the city lights. We could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. Everything changed the next day. Chris and Jen were only staying for one night. They had some family thing on Sunday they couldn't miss. So around 10 in the morning on Saturday, they packed up their stuff and we said our goodbyes. Melissa and I had planned to stay until Sunday afternoon. After they left, Melissa and I hiked around for a while, exploring some of the trails. We made lunch back at camp and then just hung out, reading books and relaxing. It was around 4 in the afternoon when I first started feeling off. I can't really explain it well. It was just this growing sensation that something wasn't right. At first I thought maybe I was getting sick, or that something I ate wasn't sitting well. But after a while, I realized what it felt like. It felt like someone was watching me. You know that feeling you get when someone's staring at you from across a room? It was like that, but amplified. Every time I turned to look at the tree line surrounding our campsite, I expected to see someone standing there, but there was never anything visible. I didn't mention it to Melissa right away. I didn't want to freak her out over what was probably just my imagination. But as the afternoon wore on and the sun started to dip behind the mountains, the feeling only got stronger. By the time we were making dinner, I was constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest seemed to be closing in around us. Melissa finally noticed something was up and asked me what was wrong. "Do you feel like, I don't know, like we're being watched?" I asked her. She looked around, then shrugged. "Not really. It's super quiet out here, though. Maybe that's what's creeping you out." I nodded, trying to convince myself that was all it was. We were just isolated, and my brain was playing tricks on me. We finished dinner and built up the fire as darkness fell completely. Sitting there by the firelight, I kept staring into the black wall of trees surrounding us. The feeling had become so intense that I was having trouble focusing on our conversation. Melissa tried to get me to relax, suggesting we have another beer, telling me stories about her work drama, normal stuff to distract me. It helped a little. By the time we decided to turn in, around 11, I had almost convinced myself I was being ridiculous. We put out the fire properly, used our flashlights to get to the tent, and got ready for bed. Our sleeping bags were zipped together to make one big one. Melissa fell asleep almost immediately, curled against me. I lay there in the darkness, listening to her breathing, trying to calm my mind enough to sleep. The forest was incredibly quiet. No distant cars, no human sounds at all. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the pine trees and some far-off animal noises I couldn't identify. I must have lain there for at least an hour, drifting in and out of a light doze, never fully sleeping. It was sometime after midnight. I don't know exactly when, because I didn't want to disturb Melissa by checking my watch, when I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps. At first I thought I was imagining it, or that maybe it was a deer or something running through the campsite. But as the sound got louder, I knew this wasn't an animal. This was bipedal, 2 legs, a person. The footfalls were heavy, like someone wearing boots and running flat-footed, not the light, careful steps of someone trying to be quiet. This was someone running, full speed, through our campsite in the pitch black. The sound came from the direction of the dirt access road, pounding across the hard ground toward our tent. My whole body went rigid. Melissa was still sound asleep, but I was frozen in absolute terror. I couldn't even bring myself to wake her. The footsteps tore past our tent, maybe 20 feet away, and continued into the woods on the other side of our campsite. Fast, heavy, deliberate. The rhythm was unmistakably human, but there was something off about it. The stride seemed too long, the impact too heavy. And here's the thing that still bothers me the most. There was no light, no flashlight beam bouncing through the trees, no voice calling out, no explanation for why someone would be sprinting through a remote campsite in the middle of the night in complete darkness. The footsteps faded as whatever it was ran deeper into the forest. I lay there, barely breathing, straining my ears for any other sounds. Part of me expected the runner to circle back, to return to our campsite. But there was nothing, just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, holding Melissa, listening for any sound of the runner returning. Every small noise made my heart race. I kept imagining someone, or something, standing just outside our tent, watching us. When the first grey light of dawn finally appeared, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I carefully disentangled myself from Melissa and the sleeping bag and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The morning air was cold and misty. The campsite looked exactly as we had left it. Nothing was disturbed. Our cooler was still on the picnic table. The remains of our fire were untouched. I walked to where I thought the footsteps had passed. The ground was a mix of dry pine needles and hard-packed dirt. I searched for footprints, broken branches, anything that might confirm what I'd heard. There was nothing. Not a single sign that anyone had run through there just hours earlier. I expanded my search, walking in widening circles around our campsite. I kept expecting to find something, a footprint, a discarded item, some evidence that I hadn't imagined the whole thing, but there was absolutely nothing. By the time I got back to the tent, Melissa was awake and making coffee on our camp stove. "You're up early," she said, yawning. "Everything okay?" I almost told her then, about the feeling of being watched, about the footsteps in the night. But looking at her in the morning light, so normal and unbothered, I couldn't bring myself to spoil the trip. What would I even say? That I heard someone running through our campsite but couldn't find any evidence of it? "Yeah, just restless," I said instead. "Want to pack up after breakfast? We could head back early, maybe stop somewhere nice for lunch on the way." She gave me a curious look, but agreed. I think she could tell something was wrong, but she didn't push it. We ate breakfast quickly and packed up our gear. The whole time I kept scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching us. The feeling of being observed had returned with the daylight, almost stronger than before. As we were loading the last of our stuff into my Jeep, Melissa finally asked, "Tyler, what's going on? You've been acting weird since yesterday." I hesitated, then decided to tell her a version of the truth. "I think I heard someone running through our campsite last night. Probably just another camper who got lost or something, but it freaked me out a little." She frowned. "Running? In the middle of the night? That's weird." "Yeah, weird." I didn't mention the complete darkness, or how heavy the footsteps had sounded, or the impossible length of the stride that had allowed whatever it was to cross our campsite in just seconds. We drove down the mountain in mostly silence. I kept checking the rearview mirror, though I couldn't have explained what I was looking for. Melissa and I broke up about 2 months later, not because of the camping trip specifically, but I know my behavior changed after that. I became more paranoid, more on edge. I didn't want to go hiking or camping anymore. When she pressed me about what was wrong, I couldn't give her a satisfactory answer. How do you explain to someone that you heard something impossible? That for just a few seconds, your understanding of what's normal was completely shattered? I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a park ranger doing a night patrol. Maybe it was another camper who had set up somewhere nearby that we hadn't noticed. Maybe it was just a deer, and my half-asleep brain misinterpreted the sound. But none of those explanations feel right. The ranger would have had a flashlight. Another camper wouldn't run through an occupied site in total darkness. And I know what deer sound like. This was bipedal without question. I've never gone back to Palomar Mountain. I rarely go camping at all anymore. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see if I can make sense of what happened. But then I imagine standing in that same campsite as darkness falls, and I know I never will. What bothers me most isn't just what I heard that night. It's that after 32 years, I still have no explanation, no closure. Just the memory of those heavy footsteps running through the darkness and the absolute certainty that whatever made them wasn't just passing by our campsite by accident. It knew we were there. Story 13. I can't believe I've waited 6 years to share this. It happened in summer of 2017, and I still get cold sweats thinking about it. My parents and I were visiting my aunt in Fairview, North Carolina for a couple weeks. We brought our German Shepherd, Max, with us because he loves hiking, and my aunt has this huge fenced backyard. Max was about 5 years old at the time, a big boy, almost 90 pounds of pure muscle and energy. He was always super confident, the kind of dog that would chase anything without hesitation. I've seen him go after deer twice his size without even thinking about it. That's why what happened that day was so disturbing. It was a Wednesday morning in July, hot but not unbearable. My dad suggested we take Max out to this trail my aunt had mentioned. It was about 15 minutes from her house, a popular hiking spot, but supposedly not too crowded on weekdays. The trail followed an old logging road that branched into smaller paths through dense forest. Beautiful place. Tall trees creating this green canopy overhead, wildflowers along the path, that fresh forest smell. We arrived around 10 in the morning, and the parking area only had 2 other cars. Perfect. Max was excited as always, pulling on his leash and sniffing everything. Dad had him on one of those retractable leashes that gives him some freedom, but keeps him from running off completely. Mom packed some sandwiches and water in a small backpack, and we set off. The first hour was completely normal. We passed an older couple heading back to the parking lot, but otherwise had the trail to ourselves. Max was having the time of his life, investigating every interesting smell, marking trees, and trotting ahead as far as the leash would allow. I remember feeling so relaxed and happy to be out in nature. But then Max's behavior started changing. It was subtle at first. He stopped pulling ahead and started walking closer to us. I didn't think much of it initially. Maybe he was getting tired or the novelty had worn off. But then I noticed him looking off into the woods more frequently, his ears perked up and alert. "Is Max okay?" Mom asked after he suddenly stopped and stared intensely into a particularly dense section of trees. Dad tugged gently on the leash. "Come on, buddy. What do you see?" "A squirrel." Max reluctantly started walking again, but he stayed right next to Dad's leg, which was weird. This dog loved to be at the full extension of his leash, exploring everything. Now, he was practically glued to us. About 15 minutes later, things got really strange. We were maybe 2 miles into the trail when Max just stopped. His whole body language changed in an instant. His tail tucked between his legs, ears flattened against his head, and he started making this low whimpering sound I'd never heard before. "Max?" I crouched down next to him, genuinely concerned. His muscles were tense, and I could feel a slight tremor running through his body. "What's wrong, boy?" That's when we heard it. A series of loud cracks coming from about 30 feet off the trail to our right, not like twigs snapping under someone's foot, but like substantial branches breaking. Whatever was making that noise was heavy. Probably just a deer, Dad said, but his voice had that forced casualness parents use when they're trying not to worry their kids. Then the smell hit us. I've tried to describe it to people before, but words don't do it justice. It was like rotting meat left in the sun for days, mixed with wet fur and something musky, so overpowering that I actually gagged. Mum covered her nose with her shirt. "Good Lord, did something die out here?" she asked, looking around. Max was now pressing himself against Dad's legs, still making that whimpering sound. I've never seen a 90-pound German shepherd look so small. "Let's keep going," Dad suggested. "Whatever died is probably attracting scavengers. Best not to hang around." We continued walking, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The forest that had seemed so peaceful now felt oppressive. I kept looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling we were being watched. About 10 minutes later, Mom grabbed my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I stopped and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, just the normal forest sounds. But then I realized that wasn't quite right. The birds had gone quiet. The only sound was a rustling in the underbrush that seemed to match our movements. When we stopped, it stopped. When we walked, it walked. "Something's following us," I said, my voice barely audible. Dad, always the practical one, tried to dismiss it. "It's probably just an echo or our minds playing tricks on us." But Max knew better. His eyes were fixed on the dense foliage to our left, his body trembling more visibly now. We picked up our pace, trying to move quickly without running. The thing in the woods kept pace with us, sometimes falling behind only to suddenly be ahead of us again, as if it was circling around. That's when we came across the structure. Just off the trail, maybe 15 feet in, was what looked like a crude shelter or nest. It wasn't natural. Someone or something had deliberately constructed it by bending living saplings into an arch and weaving branches between them. Inside was a shallow pit, lined with fresh grass and leaves. "What the hell is that?" Dad muttered, stepping closer to examine it. "Don't," Mom said sharply. "Let's just keep moving." The smell was stronger near the structure, almost unbearable. Max was now openly whining, trying to pull Dad in the opposite direction. "It's probably just some kids playing around," Dad said, but he didn't sound convinced. As we moved past the structure, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had goosebumps despite the summer heat. That's when we heard the tree fall. It wasn't subtle, a massive cracking sound followed by a thunderous crash about 50 yards behind us. The ground actually vibrated. It sounded like a tree had been forcefully pushed over, not like one falling naturally from rot or wind. Almost simultaneously, something large moved through the underbrush on the opposite side of the trail. I couldn't see it clearly, just glimpses of movement through the leaves. Whatever it was big enough to shake small trees as it passed. Max lost it. He let out a series of panicked barks that turned into a terrified yelp, then bolted with such force that the retractable leash snapped out of Dad's hand. The plastic handle hit the ground, and Max took off down the trail toward the parking lot, dragging the leash behind him. "Max!" Dad shouted, running after him. Mom and I followed, no longer caring about staying calm. We were running full out, pure adrenaline taking over. Behind us, I could hear crashing sounds as whatever had been paralleling us in the woods was now in full pursuit. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, branches whipping my face and arms as I stumbled along the increasingly narrow trail. Mom was right behind me, and I could hear her panicked breathing. Dad was ahead, chasing after Max, who was now completely out of sight. The sounds behind us were getting closer, heavy footfalls and breaking branches. Whatever was chasing us wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. The awful smell seemed to be all around us now, like we were running through a cloud of it. "Don't look back," Mum gasped between breaths. "Just run!" But of course I looked back, just for a split second. I couldn't make out a clear shape in the dense undergrowth, just a large, dark mass moving between the trees. What I remember most vividly was the unnatural way the foliage moved, as if being pushed aside by something tall. The trail curved sharply, and suddenly we could see the clearing ahead. Dad had caught up to Max at the edge of the woods and was grabbing his leash. Relief flooded through me as we burst out of the tree line into the open area near the parking lot. The second we hit the clearing, the crashing sounds behind us stopped abruptly. It was like whatever was chasing us refused to leave the cover of the forest. We reached the car, all of us gasping for breath. Max was shaking uncontrollably, trying to squeeze himself under the car. Dad had to physically pull him out and lift him into the back seat. Even then, Max curled up on the floor rather than sitting on the seat where he could see out the windows. As Dad started the car, I looked back at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a tall, dark figure partially obscured by the foliage, just standing there watching us. But it was gone so quickly, I can't be sure it wasn't just my terrified imagination. We drove back to my aunt's house in complete silence. Nobody wanted to be the first to acknowledge what had happened. Max stayed on the floor of the car the entire ride, still trembling. That night, Max refused to go outside for his usual evening bathroom break. Dad had to literally carry him out, and he did his business right next to the porch before scrambling back inside. He slept in my room that night, something he never did, pressed up against my bed as if for protection. We never told my aunt what happened. What would we even say? That something chased us in the woods? That we found some weird nest? It all sounded crazy in the light of day. We looked up local news reports for the next few weeks, half expecting to read about someone else having a similar experience, or maybe even someone going missing in those woods. But there was nothing. I've tried researching similar incidents in that area since then. I found a few vague accounts of hikers feeling watched or hearing strange noises, but nothing as intense as what we experienced. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear or even some homeless person living in the woods. But neither explanation fully fits what we experienced. The way it moved, the structure we found, the deliberate way it seemed to stalk us. Max was never the same after that day. He became much more cautious outdoors, especially in wooded areas. My confident, fearless dog now gets anxious if we even walk near the edge of a forest. He knows something we don't, and that terrifies me more than anything else. I haven't been back to North Carolina since, and I have no plans to return. Some things are better left alone, and whatever lives in those woods outside Fairview is definitely one of them. Story 14. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. Most people would think I'm crazy or making this up for attention, but I swear on everything I love that what I'm about to tell you is absolutely real. My hands are still shaking as I type this. About 8 months ago, my family and I moved from suburban Portland to a small rural property in Washington state. My husband Mark got a job offer we couldn't refuse, and we fell in love with this old 2-story farmhouse sitting on 5 acres, bordered by forest on one side and opening to meadows on the other. It was perfect, quiet, private, and enough space for our boys to run around. Nick is 15 and John is 5. We even got a pony for John since he's always been animal crazy, and I thought it would teach him responsibility. The previous owners had left behind a small corral and pasture area, so it seemed meant to be. Everything was picture perfect those first few months. Mark traveled for work sometimes, but we were settling into our new routine. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened during one of his business trips. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early spring. The weather was unusually clear for Washington. Sunny, around 60 degrees, with that crisp feeling in the air. Mark had been gone since Monday and wouldn't be back until Friday. I was in the kitchen, standing on a stepladder, cleaning the tops of the cabinets. You know, Those spaces that collect dust and grease that nobody ever sees, but drive you crazy knowing they're there. I had the window open to let in fresh air when I heard our pony, Butterscotch, making the strangest sounds. Not his usual neighing, but something more distressed, almost panicky. I looked out and saw him pacing in circles in the corral, tossing his head, clearly agitated about something. "Nick," I called upstairs where he was doing homework, "can you check on Butterscotch? Something's bothering him." Nick came downstairs, slightly annoyed at being interrupted, but headed outside. I watched through the kitchen window as he walked across our yard toward the corral. The pasture beyond slopes gently downward toward a tree line, with a small path leading into the woods. We have a creek down there that eventually opens to a small, pebbly beach area. Nick had just reached the pasture when he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. Even from the distance, I could see his entire body language change. He went completely rigid, just standing there, staring toward the edge of the property where the path descends to the trees. At first, I thought maybe a deer or something had startled him, but then, even from where I was, I heard this sound, not quite a scream, not quite a roar, that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was loud enough to hear clearly inside the house, even through the window, like nothing I've ever heard before. Something between a warning and a declaration. The sound made Nick stumble backward. He actually fell on his butt, still staring at whatever was down there. Then he scrambled up and ran back to the house, faster than I've ever seen him move. He burst through the door, face white as a sheet. "Mom!" he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "There's something out there. It's huge. I swear to God it's a Sasquatch or something." Now, I should mention that we're not the type of family who believes in this stuff. Mark and I are both college-educated, practical people. Nick is a science kid who wants to be an engineer. We're not into conspiracy theories or cryptids or anything like that. "Nick, come on," I said, thinking he was messing with me. "What did you really see?" "I'm serious, Mom." His voice cracked, and I could see he was genuinely terrified. It walked right across the clearing at the bottom of our pasture. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was walking on two legs, but it didn't move like a human. I looked out the window again, scanning the tree line. Where exactly? Down by where the path meets the trees. It's probably gone now, but Mom, I swear I'm not making this up. John was in the living room playing with his Legos, completely oblivious to what was happening. I didn't want to scare him. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's go look together. John, honey, stay inside and play. Nick and I need to check something outside real quick." I grabbed our binoculars from the hall closet, and Nick and I walked back out. He was reluctant, staying close to me. "It was right there," he said, pointing toward the spot where our property meets the forest. "It walked from that side to the other, then disappeared into the trees." We stood there scanning the area for a few minutes, seeing nothing unusual. I was about to suggest we go back inside when Nick grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "There," he whispered urgently. "By the beach. It's still there." I followed his gaze and lifted the binoculars. What I saw through them made my entire body go cold. About 30 meters away, partially visible at the edge of the trees near our little beach area, was something. Someone. A figure standing perfectly still, watching us. It was broad daylight. There was no mistaking what I was looking at, though my brain kept trying to rationalize it. A bear standing upright, maybe a hunter in camouflage. But it wasn't either of those things. The creature had black-gray fur with distinctive white tips that caught the sunlight. Around its shoulders and upper chest, the coloring shifted to a reddish-brown. It was tall, I'd guess around 6.5 feet. But what struck me most was how lean it was. Not skinny, but muscular in a way that seemed almost athletic. That sounds ridiculous to say about a creature covered in fur, but that's the only way I can describe it. Its arms were incredibly long, with hands that nearly touched the ground. We stood frozen, staring at each other across the distance. It made no move toward us, and we certainly weren't moving toward it. For nearly a full minute, this standoff continued in complete silence. Then, in one fluid motion, it turned and crossed our creek, a crossing that would take a person several careful steps on the stones, in what looked like 2 effortless strides. Then it was gone, disappearing into the denser part of the forest. Nick and I stayed rooted to the spot. I don't know how long we stood there before I finally found my voice. Did you see its face?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nick nodded slowly. "It had this broad face, kind of flat but not like a gorilla. Its eyes were deep set, like amber or yellowish brown, and its brow was really heavy." He held his hands out. "And its hands, Mom, they were enormous." We hurried back to the house, locked all the doors and closed all the blinds. I called Mark, but it went to voicemail. He was in meetings all afternoon. I didn't know what to do. Call the police and say what? That we saw Bigfoot? They'd think we were pranking them or needed psychiatric help. The rest of the day was tense. I kept John away from the windows, making up a game where we had to pretend the house was a spaceship. Nick kept checking the locks. Neither of us mentioned what we'd seen to John. He's 5. He'd either be terrified or want to go find the monster. That night, I barely slept. Every crack, every normal house noise had me sitting upright in bed. I kept imagining that thing standing outside, watching our house. By morning, I was exhausted and half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. After I got John off to kindergarten and Nick to high school, I worked up the courage to go back down to the creek. I'm not sure what compelled me. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that it had all been some weird shared hallucination. The ground was damp from morning dew, and there, clear as day along the muddy bank of the creek, were footprints. Not one set, but 2. One large, one much smaller. The bigger prints measured about 12 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. The smaller set was about half that size. My mind immediately went to a parent and child, which sent a whole new wave of shivers through me. I tried to follow the tracks, but they disappeared into the brush where the ground was covered in pine needles and harder forest floor. I took photos with my phone, measuring the prints against my hand for scale. When Nick got home from school, I showed him the pictures. He got very quiet. "Mom," he finally said, "we need to tell someone about this." But who? I didn't want our new neighbors thinking we were crazy. We'd only lived here a few months. We'd be those nut jobs who think they saw Bigfoot forever. Eventually, I broke down and told our nearest neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, who lives about a half-mile down the road. To my surprise, she didn't laugh or look at me like I was insane. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and said there had been stories in these parts for generations. She put me in touch with her nephew, who worked at the Vancouver Columbian newspaper. He came out, took statements from both Nick and me separately, photographed the footprints, which were already starting to fade after a day, and published a small article about it. That led to a couple of researchers coming to look at our property, but by then, any evidence was gone. Mark was skeptical when he got home, but he could tell by our faces that we'd experienced something genuinely frightening. He installed security cameras the next weekend. It's been months now, and we haven't seen anything like it again. The cameras haven't caught anything unusual. Sometimes I wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. But then I look at the photos of those footprints, and I remember the way it moved across that creek, so effortlessly, so at home in an environment that humans have to navigate carefully. I don't know what to believe anymore. I was never someone who thought creatures like this could exist, especially not in modern-day Washington state. But I know what Nick and I saw that day. I know it wasn't a bear or a man in a costume. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes as it watched us, there was something ancient and aware in that gaze. Sometimes at night, I still wake up thinking I hear that sound, that warning call that Nick heard first. and I wonder if it's still out there, watching our house from the safety of the trees, a family of its own perhaps, living parallel lives to ours, but hidden from view. Whatever it was, that day changed something in me. The certainty I used to have about what's real and what isn't so certain anymore. And honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever feel completely alone in these woods again. Story 15. I still get goosebumps talking about this, even though it happened when I was 14. I've tried to make sense of it for years, but I can't. I'm hoping someone here might have experienced something similar, or can at least tell me I'm not crazy. My grandfather owned this massive ranch in rural Texas, around 4,600 acres, where he raised Black Angus cattle. Since I was little, I'd spend every school break there. By 14, I knew that land like the back of my hand. Every trail, creek bend, and patch of woods was familiar territory to me. I'd been doing solo overnight camping trips since I was 10, always with my .22 rifle and Bob, my grandpa's black-mouthed cur. That dog was the best companion anyone could ask for. Loyal, smart, and fearless when it came to coyotes or wild hogs. This all happened during Christmas break when I was 14. I'd gone out hunting that morning like usual. Nothing special, just checking some of my regular spots. When I got back to the house around noon, something felt off. My grandfather kept walking to the porch, looking out toward the tree line and whistling for Bob. This wasn't normal. Bob rarely left Grandpa's side, and when he did, Grandpa never seemed concerned. He was a tough old rancher who didn't show worry easily. "Bob didn't come home last night," my grandmother told me while fixing lunch. "Your grandpa's been up since 4 this morning looking for him." This struck me as strange. Bob always came home. Always. After lunch, I grabbed my rifle again, planning to do some evening hunting. The winter sun sets early, and I wanted to get to my stand with plenty of daylight left. "Where you headed?" Grandpa asked, his voice sounding different somehow. "Thought I'd hit my tree stand by the creek bottom," I replied, checking my ammo. His reaction was immediate. "No, not today. Hunt the high pasture instead." I was surprised. He'd never directed where I should hunt before. I'd earned his trust years ago. "The high pasture? But there's better game down in the bottom," I argued. "Just do as I say," he said firmly. "Stay in the high pasture today." I nodded, but as soon as he went back inside, I changed course. The best hunting was between Little Sandy and Big Sandy creeks, where game trails converged near my favorite tree stand. I'd built that stand myself in an ancient hickory tree about 16 feet up, giving me a perfect view of several trails. The December air was crisp, but not too cold, as I made my way through the familiar path toward the bottom. The sun was already getting lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I remember thinking how quiet it seemed. No birds, no squirrels chattering, just the sound of my boots on the dry leaves. I climbed up to my stand and settled in, loading my rifle and scanning the area. The stand overlooked a small clearing with thick brush and woods beyond. To my left was a high bank, where deer often appeared before moving down to the creeks. After sitting for about an hour, movement caught my eye. A doe appeared on the high bank to my left, about 70 yards away, but something was off about her behavior. She kept stomping her front hoof and making this weird whistling sound through her nose. Her head bobbed up and down as she stared intently at something in the thicket in front of my stand. I'd seen this behavior before. It usually meant a buck was nearby, and she was alerting other deer. I raised my rifle, ready for the buck I assumed would appear. The scope gave me a clearer view of the doe, still acting agitated. Then I noticed movement in the thicket directly in front of me, maybe 40 or 50 yards out. At first, I thought it was one of Grandpa's black cows that had wandered off. Sometimes they'd break through fences and end up in weird places. Through my scope, I could make out what looked like a large black shape lying down in the brush. I focused, trying to see if it had an ear tag that would confirm it was one of our cattle. But something was wrong with the hair. It wasn't the short coat of an Angus. This hair was long, shaggy, with patches of black and grey. My next thought was that it must be a wild hog. We had plenty on the property and some got huge, but even as I tried to convince myself it was a hog, I knew this was too big. If it was a hog lying down, it had to be 7 feet long at least. What happened next is burned into my memory. As I watched through the scope, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a hand, an actual hand with long fingers and black nails, reached up from the shape and placed itself against a fallen post oak log. A hand, not a hoof or a paw, a hand. I couldn't see the full body through the brush, but what I could see made my blood run cold. The hair pattern, the size, the hand, it resembled a gorilla. But there are no gorillas in rural Texas, none. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Time seemed to stop as I stared at that hand through my scope, trying to make my brain accept what my eyes were seeing. The doe suddenly bounded away, snapping me back to reality. The sun was getting dangerously low. I had maybe 30 minutes of light left. The thought of being in those woods after dark with whatever that was sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I tried to climb down from my stand as quietly as possible, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my rifle sling twice. Each sound seemed amplified in the silent woods. When I finally reached the ground, I didn't take my usual path home. Instead, I circled wide, staying in the brush until I was well, away from where I'd seen the creature. Once I reached the edge of the woods that opened into the pasture, I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life across that open field, expecting at any moment to hear something crashing through the brush behind me. I didn't look back once. I burst into the house, the screen door slamming behind me. "Grandpa, there's a gorilla in the woods!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. My grandmother rushed to me, her face pale. "What? Slow down. What did you see?" Between gasps for breath, I described what I'd witnessed, the size, the hand, everything. My grandfather sat in his chair, listening without expression. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't tell me I was imagining things, or that it must have been a bear or a hog. He just listened, his weathered face unreadable. "You stay in the house now," was all he said when I finished. That night, I noticed things I'd never seen before at my grandparents' house. All the curtains were drawn, unusual for a home so remote where privacy was never a concern. My grandfather's powerful .450-400 double rifle, normally locked in his gun cabinet, was propped beside his chair, and he didn't go to bed. He sat in that chair, occasionally moving to the porch to look out into the darkness, the rifle always in hand. The next morning, Bob showed up on the porch with a dead skunk, proud as could be. My grandfather acted like the dog had never been missing, but I noticed how he ran his hands over Bob, checking him thoroughly. The dog seemed fine, maybe a little tired. When my parents came to pick me up that afternoon, my grandfather pulled me aside. "About what you saw," he said quietly. "We don't talk about it. Understand? Not to your parents. Not to your friends. Nobody would believe you anyway." I nodded, confused but sensing the gravity in his voice. "Promise me," he insisted. "I promise," I said. He seemed satisfied and added, "Some things in this world don't have explanations. Boy, some things we just have to live with." I kept that promise for years. Eventually, I told a few close friends who mostly laughed it off. One suggested it was a bear, though bears hadn't been seen in that part of Texas for generations. Another thought maybe I'd seen someone in a costume, but out there, miles from any road, no way. What bothers me most is that my grandfather clearly knew something. The way he warned me away from the creek bottom that day, his lack of surprise at my story, the rifle by his chair, he knew. But he took whatever knowledge he had to his grave 3 years later. I'm 29 now, and I still can't explain what I saw between those creeks. I still go to the ranch, which my dad manages now, but I've never gone back to that tree stand. I don't do solo camping trips anymore. And when I do hunt, it's never without a shotgun loaded with slugs. The woods I once loved now feel different to me. Even in broad daylight, there's always this feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I'm driving the pasture roads at dusk, I catch movement at the edge of the tree line, just a shadow, gone when I look directly at it. I don't know what's out there between Little Sandy and Big Sandy. I don't want to know. But whatever it is, it's been there a long time. And I think my grandfather knew all along. Story 16. I've been debating whether to share this for months now. Every time I start typing it out, I delete everything and walk away from my computer. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this community might be one of the few places where I won't be immediately written off as crazy or attention-seeking. This happened last October when my buddy Mark and I went on our annual hunting trip in western Montana near the Bitterroot Mountains. We've been doing this trip for 8 years straight, and I've spent most of my life in these woods. I'm no rookie when it comes to wildlife encounters or the weird stuff that can happen in remote areas. But what I saw that night was something else entirely. We'd spent the whole day hiking up to this spot we'd found the previous year. A nice elevated clearing above a deep ravine that offered good visibility for deer tracks in the morning. The location was pretty isolated, about 15 miles from the nearest access road, which is exactly how we like it. No other hunters to compete with, just us and nature. By the time we finished setting up our tent and getting a fire going, the sun was already setting. We heated up some canned stew, cracked open a couple beers, and started unwinding after the long hike. The temperature was dropping fast, typical October evening in Montana, maybe 40 degrees and getting colder. Around 9 in the evening, I needed to take a leak, so I grabbed my small folding camp shovel, force of habit from my dad teaching me to bury my business in the woods, and walked about 100 feet from our campsite. The fire was burning low behind me, just enough light to see where I was going without a flashlight. I found a spot behind some trees where I could have privacy, even though it was just Mark and me for miles. I was just finishing up when this smell hit me. And when I say hit me, I mean it literally felt like someone had slapped me in the face with it. The most god-awful stench I've ever experienced. It was this combination of wet dog, like if you left a golden retriever in a pond for a week, mixed with rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. Something chemical and wrong. My eyes actually watered, and I felt a wave of nausea roll through me. My first thought was dead animal nearby, but this was different. More intense, more deliberate somehow. I quickly zipped up and turned toward where the smell seemed strongest. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, partially obscured by a pine tree, stood something I still can't fully explain. At first glance in the dim light, my brain tried to categorize it as a bear. But it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. This thing was standing on 2 legs, completely upright. It was covered in this light brownish fur that looked matted and dirty, especially around the lower half where it was darker, like it had been walking through mud. But its face and what I could see of its hands weren't furry. They were this dark, leathery brown skin. Its head was rounded, nothing like a bear's snout. And the eyes, even in the fading light, I could make out these deep-set eyes just watching me. Not moving, not blinking, just fixed on me with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. The thing stood as tall as me. I'm 6'2", but its width was what really struck me. This creature had shoulders nearly 4 feet across, making its waist look almost disproportionately narrow, despite being powerfully built. Everything about it suggested massive strength, like a bodybuilder who'd been taking steroids for decades, but with a natural, fluid quality to how it held itself. I stood there frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't even breathe. It was like my body knew that making any sudden movements would be dangerous. Finally, some survival instinct kicked in. I raised the small shovel I was still holding and yelled, "Hey!" as loud as I could. I don't know what I expected, maybe to scare it off like you would a mountain lion, or for it to rear up like a grizzly. What happened instead still gives me nightmares. The instant I moved, this thing reacted with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. It pivoted sharply on one foot and just bolted. 1 second it was there, the next it was crashing through the underbrush down toward the ravine. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I've seen. It ran upright the whole time, not dropping to all fours like a bear would. Its stride was huge, covering ground faster than an Olympic sprinter. As it fled, it was smashing through everything in its path. I heard branches snapping, not small twigs, but thick branches that would take significant force to break. The sound echoed up from the ravine for what seemed like forever, getting fainter as it moved away at incredible speed. I stood there shaking, still holding the shovel out in front of me like an idiot. Then I heard Mark yelling from camp. "Dan, you okay? What was that noise?" I stumbled back to the campfire, probably white as a sheet. Mark took one look at me and immediately grabbed his rifle. "What happened? Was it a bear?" he asked, scanning the darkness around us. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded insane even as I said them. "It wasn't a bear, Mark. It was... I don't know what it was." I described the creature in detail, the smell, how it moved, everything. I could tell he didn't believe me. He had this look on his face, the one friends give when they're trying to decide if you're pulling their leg or if you've lost your mind. "Maybe it was just a bear standing up," he suggested. "Light plays tricks on you in the dark, and that smell could have been a carcass nearby." I knew what I'd seen, but rather than argue, I just said, "Let's check it out in the morning when we have daylight." Neither of us slept much that night. I kept the fire burning high and my rifle across my lap. Every sound from the forest made me jump. That smell lingered in my nostrils for hours, like it had burned itself into my senses. When dawn finally broke, we cautiously made our way to where I'd seen the creature. The morning light revealed something that shut Mark up real quick. There, in the soft earth, were footprints. Not bear prints, not human prints either. These were massive, easily 16 inches long and incredibly deep, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. They were roughly foot-shaped, but wider across the front, with what looked like 5 toes, though the impressions weren't perfectly clear. What was clear was their direction. They led exactly where I'd said the creature had run, straight toward the ravine. There was also evidence of something large having pushed through the brush, with broken branches and disturbed ground. Mark crouched down and put his hand next to one of the prints. His hand looked tiny in comparison. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at the evidence in front of him. "What the hell made these, Dan?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told you what I saw," I replied. We followed the tracks for about 50 yards until they disappeared down the steep slope of the ravine, where the ground was too rocky and hard to hold prints. The broken vegetation continued further down, but neither of us was eager to follow deeper into that ravine. We packed up camp within the hour and hiked back out. Neither of us wanted to spend another night there. We made excuses to each other about bad weather coming, but we both knew the real reason. Since that day, I've done research online, trying to make sense of what I encountered. I've read accounts of Bigfoot sightings, but what I saw doesn't quite match the typical descriptions. This thing seemed different somehow, more primal, more dangerous. Mark and I have barely talked about it since, except once when we were drinking, and he admitted that those tracks couldn't have been faked and were like nothing he'd ever seen in 20 years of hunting. We've cancelled this year's trip to the Bitterroots. We're thinking Alaska might be nice. I still have nightmares about those eyes watching me from the shadows, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can still smell that horrific stench. It's like my brain is permanently imprinted with it. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what I saw, but the feeling I had when our eyes met. There was recognition there, not like it knew me, personally, but like it understood exactly what I was. While I had no idea what I was looking at, it was the feeling of being the prey instead of the predator for the first time in my life. I don't know if anyone else has encountered something similar in that region. Part of me hopes someone has, just so I know I'm not losing my mind. But another part of me hopes nobody else ever has to experience what I did. Whatever that thing was, it shouldn't exist in our world. And yet, it does. It's out there right now, somewhere in those mountains. I've never gone back to that spot, and I never will. Some things you only need to see once to know you should stay away forever. I still hunt, still spend time outdoors, but I'm different now. I'm always watching the tree line, always listening, always aware that we might not be at the top of the food chain after all.